Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will completely revolutionize everything you think you know about love, romance, and relationships in the medieval world. What if I told you that nearly everything Hollywood has shown us about medieval romance is based on literature that was considered radical propaganda in its time? That the passionate love stories we see in A Knight's Tale, The Princess Bride, or Game of Thrones were actually describing a revolutionary social movement that the medieval church tried desperately to suppress. Here's a fact that will blow your mind according to 12th century medical texts, including those by physician Constantinus Africanus. What we call falling in love was literally classified as a mental disorder called amahirios, or love sickness. Medieval doctors prescribed bloodletting, cold baths, and even exorcism to cure people of romantic feelings. And look, if that fact just made you think, wait, what? Then you're going to absolutely love what's coming next. I promise you've never heard this story told this way before. So if you're already intrigued, do me a huge favour and hit that like button right now. It really helps this content reach people who are as fascinated by hidden history as you are. And if you want to join me on more deep dives into the shocking truths behind everything we think we know about the past, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell because we're just getting started. But here's where this gets absolutely insane. The concept of choosing your marriage partner based on love, something that seems completely natural to us today, was so revolutionary in medieval times that it nearly tore apart the social fabric of Europe. We're talking about an idea so dangerous that promoting it could get you excommunicated from the church, stripped of your lands, or worse. In the next 2.5 hours, you're going to discover the real story behind this romantic revolution, and I promise you, it's more dramatic, more politically explosive, and more relevant to your modern dating life than any Netflix series ever created. You're going to learn how Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess of Aquitaine and later Queen of France and England, used the concept of romantic love as a political weapon that literally redrew the map of Europe. In 1152, she did something that was virtually unheard of for a medieval woman. She convinced the church to annul her marriage to Louis VII of France, claiming their union was invalid due to consanguinity. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a calculated political move that would spark conflicts lasting over 300 years. We're going to explore actual court documents from the 12th and 13th centuries that reveal a sophisticated underground network of lovers, poets, and nobles who developed secret codes, hidden meanings in poetry, and elaborate courtship rituals that make modern dating apps look primitive by comparison. But before you think this is just some dry history lesson, let me tell you why this matters to your life today. Every single romantic expectation you have, the idea that you should fall in love before marriage, that women should have a choice in their romantic partners, that relationships should be based on emotional connection rather than just practical considerations. These concepts that seem obvious to us were literally invented by a small group of French and English nobles in the 12th century. According to historical records from the court of Poitiers, around 1170, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, Marguerite de Champagne, commissioned a cleric named Andreas Capellanus to write De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love. This wasn't just a book. It was essentially the world's first dating manual, complete with rules, strategies, and philosophical frameworks that are still influencing how we think about relationships today. Here's what's going to shock you. Andreas Capellanus literally created the concept of the friend zone. He wrote that true love could only exist between unmarried people, that the best relationships involved some level of unattainability, and that the pursuit itself was more noble than the achievement. Sound familiar? Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something. The historical evidence we're discussing comes from primary sources, actual medieval documents, court records, literary manuscripts, and contemporary chronicles that have been verified by scholars like John F. Benton of Caltech, who spent decades studying courtly love literature, and Georges Duby, the French historian who revolutionized our understanding of medieval marriage customs. But here's the most mind-blowing part. While we think of the medieval period as oppressive to women, the courtly love movement actually gave women more social power and agency than they'd had in centuries. However, this power came with a catch that most people don't understand, and it's a catch that's still affecting relationships today. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just inspire poets and lovers, she controlled more territory than the King of France himself. When she separated from Louis VII, she took with her the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, which included about a third of modern France. Then, just 8 weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II of England. This wasn't just a romantic choice, it was a geopolitical earthquake that created the Angevin Empire and set the stage for centuries of conflict between France and England. The chronicler William of Newburgh wrote that Eleanor's choices changed the face of Europe, and he wasn't exaggerating. The 100 Years' War, the conflicts that inspired Shakespeare's history plays, the battles that killed hundreds of thousands of people, they all trace back, in part, to Eleanor's revolutionary idea that a woman could choose her own husband. But here's what really gets me excited about this story. Eleanor didn't just change politics, she created the world's first influencer culture. Her court at Poitiers became the medieval equivalent of Hollywood, attracting troubadours, poets, and artists from across Europe. These weren't just entertainers, they were cultural revolutionaries spreading dangerous new ideas about love, choice, and individual happiness. According to the contemporary chronicler Geoffrey of Vigeois, Eleanor's court hosted courts of love, elaborate role-playing events where nobles would debate questions like, can true love exist between married people? Or, is it better to love someone who doesn't love you back than to settle for someone who does? These weren't just games, they were reshaping European culture in real time. And here's the crazy part, the Church knew exactly how dangerous these ideas were. Pope Innocent III wrote letters condemning courtly love as a corruption of Christian values, and church councils specifically banned certain troubadour songs. The religious establishment understood that if people started believing they had the right to choose their romantic partners, the entire medieval social system, which was based on arranged marriages, political alliances, and economic transactions, would collapse. But why should you care about any of this? Because every frustration you've ever had with modern dating, every unrealistic expectation about relationships, every rom-com cliché that's ever annoyed you, they all trace back to these medieval innovations. The reason we expect to fall in love before marriage, the reason we think relationships should be passionate and emotionally fulfilling, the reason we believe in the one, these ideas didn't evolve naturally. They were consciously created by medieval nobles as tools of social and political rebellion. And here's the kicker. Many of these ideas were never meant to apply to real marriages. Courtly love was originally designed as a sophisticated form of fantasy, a way for nobles to explore emotional and sexual desires that their actual arranged marriages couldn't fulfill. It was meant to be aspirational fiction, not a practical guide to relationships. But somehow, over the centuries, these fantasy ideals became our reality. We're living our actual romantic lives according to rules that were originally designed for medieval role-playing games. Now, I know some of you might be thinking this sounds too crazy to be true. How could medieval ideas really be influencing modern relationships? Well, consider this the next time you see a movie where someone says, I can't marry him because I don't love him. Or, I'm waiting for true love. Or, I'd rather be alone than settle. You're watching a direct descendant of Eleanor of Aquitaine's revolutionary philosophy, filtered through 900 years of cultural evolution. The evidence for all of this isn't just literary, it's documented in legal records, economic transactions, and political treaties. When Eleanor married Henry VII, she retained control of Aquitaine through a marriage contract that was revolutionary for its time. Contemporary documents show that she negotiated terms that gave her unprecedented autonomy, and these contracts became models for later marriages among the nobility. But to understand how we got from Eleanor's political rebellion to modern romantic expectations, we need to go back to where it all began, the brutal reality of what marriage and sexuality actually looked like in medieval Europe, before this romantic revolution started. Because here's what most people don't realise before Eleanor and her circle invented courtly love. Medieval marriage wasn't just unromantic, it was a completely different institution than what we understand today. We're talking about a world where a woman's consent to marriage was legally irrelevant, where sexual desire was considered a sin even within marriage, and where the average age of marriage for noble girls was 12 to 14 years old. Understanding this context isn't just historically interesting, it's crucial for understanding why the Romantic Revolution was so explosive, why it spread so quickly across Europe, and why it's still shaping our expectations today. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine and her contemporaries weren't just writing pretty poetry about love, they were staging a fundamental rebellion against the entire structure of medieval society. And that rebellion succeeded so completely that we can't even imagine a world without romantic love. But as we're about to discover, that success came at a price that nobody anticipated, and we're still paying for it today. So let's travel back to the year 1137 to a cold stone castle in Bordeaux, where a 15-year-old girl named Eleanor is about to enter into a marriage that will change the course of human history. Not because it was romantic, but because it was so utterly lacking in romance that it would inspire her to invent an entirely new way of thinking about love, power, and human relationships. Get ready to have everything you thought you knew about medieval romance completely turned upside down. But to understand how one woman could revolutionize the entire concept of love, we first need to see exactly what she was rebelling against. So let's talk about what medieval marriage actually looked like before Eleanor of Aquitaine turned everything upside down. And I'm warning you right now, this is going to make you appreciate Tinder in a whole new way. Picture this, you're a 12-year-old girl in medieval Europe, and your parents just told you that you're getting married next month to a 40-year-old lord you've never met who lives 3 countries away. Oh, and by the way, your wedding gift to him is half of France. How's that for a relationship status update? This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. According to canon law established by Pope Alexander III in 1179, girls could be married as young as 12 and boys at 14. But here's the kicker. The actual marriage ceremony was often just a legal formality. The real business happened in the marriage negotiations, which could take years and involved more lawyers than a modern corporate merger. Let me give you a real example that'll blow your mind. In 1137, when Eleanor of Aquitaine was about 15, her marriage to Louis VII of France wasn't arranged by Cupid. It was orchestrated by her dying father, William Mex of Aquitaine, who literally wrote in his will that whoever married Eleanor would inherit the entire Duchy of Aquitaine. We're talking about territory that included modern-day southwestern France, worth billions in today's money. So Louis VII didn't fall in love with Eleanor's sparkling personality or her medieval dating profile. He married her because she came with the best dowry package in Europe. Think of it like this if Eleanor was on a medieval version of The Bachelor. The final rose ceremony would have been held in a boardroom with accountants present. And here's what really gets me. The wedding contract between Eleanor and Louis VII, which still exists in the French National Archives, reads more like a business acquisition than anything we'd recognise as romantic. It specifies exactly which territories Eleanor brings to the marriage, what happens to those territories if she dies without male heirs, and even includes clauses about military obligations. There's literally more passion in your average software licensing agreement. But it wasn't just the nobility living this way. According to research by historian Francis Guise, even among peasants, marriage was primarily an economic transaction. A farmer didn't marry his neighbour's daughter because she made his heart skip a beat. He married her because combining their family's land holdings would make both farms more viable. Romance, if it existed at all, was something that might develop after marriage, not before. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least people back then had realistic expectations about relationships. And you know what? You're not wrong. Medieval people weren't sitting around complaining that their marriages lacked passion or emotional fulfillment, because those concepts didn't really exist yet. It's like being disappointed that your horse doesn't have GPS. The technology simply wasn't available. But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly kind of sad. Women in medieval times were legally considered property in most of Europe. The legal term was femme couverte, which meant a married woman had no legal existence separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even make a will without his permission. When Eleanor married Louis VII, she didn't just become Queen of France, she essentially ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if getting married today meant you literally couldn't have your own bank account, couldn't sign a lease, couldn't even buy a coffee without your spouse's written permission. That was reality for medieval women, regardless of their social class. And the church had some very specific ideas about marriage and sexuality that would make a Victorian prude blush. According to St. Augustine's teachings, which dominated medieval Christian thought, sexual desire was inherently sinful, even within marriage. The ideal Christian marriage was one where husband and wife lived together like brother and sister, only engaging in sexual activity for the specific purpose of procreation. Pope Gregory the Great actually wrote that married couples should feel guilty about enjoying sex, even with each other. He suggested that couples should abstain from intercourse on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, during Advent, during a woman's menstrual period, during pregnancy, and for at least 40 days after childbirth. If you do the math, that leaves about 20 days per year when marital intimacy was technically approved by the Church. Talk about scheduling conflicts, but here's a perfect example of how disconnected the Church's ideals were from reality. We have records from medieval monasteries showing that monks regularly received payments from nobles seeking forgiveness for the sin of excessive marital affection. Apparently, even married couples following church doctrine could get in trouble for enjoying each other's company too much. It's like getting a speeding ticket for having fun while driving the speed limit. Now, let me share something that really hit me when I was researching this. I found a letter in the British Library archives, written around 1140 by a noblewoman named Heloise to her husband Peter Abelard. Yes, that Abelard. One of the most famous love stories in medieval history. But this letter wasn't romantic. She was essentially apologising for feeling affection toward him, because she'd been taught that emotional attachment to one's spouse was a distraction from devotion to God. Can you imagine living in a world where loving your own husband was considered morally suspect? Where the very feelings that we consider essential to a healthy marriage were classified as spiritual weaknesses? And this brings us to something that I think is really important to understand about this period. Medieval people weren't emotionally limited or incapable of deep feelings. The surviving letters, diaries, and personal documents from this era show that people experienced the full range of human emotions, including what we'd recognize as romantic love. They just didn't have social permission to act on those feelings, especially when it came to choosing marriage partners. It's like everyone was playing a massive game of emotional hide and seek, where the rules said you could feel whatever you wanted, but you couldn't let those feelings influence any major life decisions. Imagine if today's society said, sure, you can fall in love, but you have to marry whoever your parents pick for financial reasons, and you're not allowed to complain about it. But here's the thing that gives me hope about human nature even under these incredibly restrictive conditions. People found ways to express genuine affection and form real emotional bonds. Medieval chroniclers wrote about couples who clearly cared for each other deeply, even if their marriages had been arranged. Archaeological evidence from medieval households shows personal gifts between spouses, love tokens, and other signs of genuine affection. The human heart, it seems, is remarkably resilient. Even when society tries to turn love into a business transaction, people find ways to inject humanity and warmth into their relationships. And that's actually the most important lesson from this period. The capacity for love isn't something that was invented in the 12th century. It's a fundamental part of human nature that has always existed. What changed wasn't people's ability to feel love. It was their permission to act on it, to make it a priority, to build their lives around it. Eleanor of Aquitaine proved that one person with enough courage, intelligence, and resources could literally reshape culture. She took the most basic human emotion, love, and turned it into a tool for social and political transformation. But Eleanor couldn't have started a love revolution by herself. She needed allies, collaborators, and most importantly, she needed artists who could take her ideas and turn them into something beautiful, compelling, and irresistible. But here's what makes Eleanor's story so extraordinary. She didn't just suffer through this brutal system we've been talking about. She was about to completely destroy it, and the way she did it was so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would shock medieval Europe to its core. And destroy it she did. What Eleanor did next was the most audacious power move in medieval history. This is the story of how one woman's divorce created the concept of romantic love and nearly started a war between France and England that would last for centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just any medieval woman. She was essentially the Jeff Bezos of 12th century Europe, except instead of Amazon, she controlled a territory that made up about a third of modern France. When her father William X died in 1137, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine. making her the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. And by eligible, I mean every king, prince, and ambitious nobleman was basically sliding into her DMs with marriage proposals. But here's where Eleanor's story gets absolutely wild. After 15 years of marriage to Louis VII of France, a marriage that, by all accounts, was about as romantic as a tax audit, she did something that was virtually unheard of for a woman in the 12th century. She convinced the church to annul her marriage. Not divorce. Annul, meaning she argued that her marriage had never been valid in the first place. Now, you might think, okay, so she got a divorce. Big deal. But you have to understand this was 1152 and women simply did not leave their husbands, especially when that husband happened to be the King of France. According to the chronicler William of Newburgh, Eleanor's decision astonished all of Christendom. It would be like if today, the First Lady announced she was leaving the President because she felt unfulfilled in the relationship. The scandal would break the internet. Eleanor's official reason for the annulment was consanguinity. She claimed that she and Louis were too closely related by blood for their marriage to be valid under church law. But here's what really happened. According to contemporary sources, Eleanor had fallen in love with someone else. A younger, more dynamic, more attractive someone else named Henry Plantagenet, who would later become Henry VI of England. The medieval chronicler Gerald of Wales wrote that Eleanor found Louis VII to be more like a monk than a king. Apparently, Louis was so pious that he made their marriage feel like living in a monastery. Eleanor once famously complained that she had married a monk, not a king. Imagine being married to someone so religious that they make watching paint dry seem exciting by comparison. But Eleanor's attraction to Henry Plantagenet wasn't just physical, though by all accounts, Henry was quite the medieval heartthrob. At 19, he was tall, athletic, intelligent, and politically ambitious. More importantly, he shared Eleanor's vision of what a royal court could be. While Louis VII's court was austere and focused on prayer and penance, Henry represented something revolutionary, the idea that power and pleasure could coexist. Here's the most shocking part of this story. Just 8 weeks after her marriage to Louis VII was annulled, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet. 8 weeks in medieval terms. That was like getting divorced on Monday and remarried on Tuesday. The speed of this transition scandalized Europe and convinced everyone that Eleanor had been planning this for years. And they were probably right. According to the chronicler Matthew Paris, Eleanor and Henry had been secretly corresponding for months before her annulment. She wasn't just leaving an unhappy marriage, she was executing a carefully planned romantic and political coup that would reshape the balance of power in medieval Europe. But here's what makes Eleanor's choice truly revolutionary. She didn't just choose a new husband based on political advantage. She chose someone she was actually attracted to, someone who excited her intellectually and physically. In a world where marriage was purely transactional, Eleanor was essentially inventing the radical concept that personal happiness could be a factor in major life decisions. The political consequences were immediate and catastrophic. By marrying Henry, Eleanor took the vast Duchy of Aquitaine with her, effectively transferring about a third of France to England. Louis VII lost more territory in Eleanor's divorce settlement than most kings conquered in their entire lifetimes. It was like losing California, Texas, and Florida all in one day. But Eleanor's true revolution wasn't political, it was cultural. When she established her court at Poitiers around 1170, she created something that had never existed before, a space where romantic love was not just tolerated, but celebrated and theorized about. According to the chronicler Geoffrey of Vigeois, Eleanor's court became a school of courtesy and honor, where nobles from across Europe came to learn new ways of thinking about love, relationships, and personal fulfillment. This wasn't just a medieval singles club. Eleanor was essentially creating the world's first think tank devoted to romantic relationships. She commissioned poets, philosophers, and writers to explore questions that no one had ever seriously considered before. What is love? Can it exist within marriage? Should personal attraction matter more than political advantage? Is it possible to love someone who doesn't love you back? The most famous example of this intellectual revolution was Eleanor's daughter Marie de Champagne, who commissioned a cleric named Andreas Capellanus to write De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love. This wasn't just a book, It was essentially the medieval equivalent of the rules or he's just not that into you, except instead of helping people navigate modern dating, it was creating the entire concept of dating in the first place. Andreas Capellanus' book included specific rules for romantic relationships that sound almost modern today. Rule number 1, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Rule number 7, no one can be bound by a double love. Rule number 12, a true lover does not desire to embrace in love anyone except his beloved. These weren't just suggestions, they were revolutionary philosophical statements that challenged the entire foundation of medieval society. But here's what really gets me about Eleanor's story. She didn't just talk about romantic revolution, she lived it. Contemporary sources describe her as someone who remained intellectually and romantically engaged well into her 70s. Even after Henry III died, she continued to play an active role in politics and culture, supporting troubadours, commissioning literature, and advising her sons on matters of both statecraft and the heart. And let's talk about those sons for a moment, because Eleanor's approach to parenting was as revolutionary as her approach to marriage. She raised Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland to believe that they had the right to choose their own romantic partners, that emotional fulfillment was important, and that love could be a form of political power. Whether this was good parenting is debatable. Both sons had notoriously tumultuous love lives, but it certainly wasn't conventional. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden wrote that Eleanor taught her sons that the heart's desires should not be ignored in favour of mere duty. This might sound like obvious parenting advice today, but in the 12th century, it was borderline heretical. Most noble children were taught that personal feelings were irrelevant to their life choices. But here's the thing that really strikes me about Eleanor's influence. She understood that romantic love could be a form of soft power. By making her court at Poitiers a centre of romantic innovation, she attracted the most talented poets, musicians, and intellectuals in Europe. These weren't just entertainers, they were cultural ambassadors who spread Eleanor's ideas about love and relationships across the continent. It's like if someone today created a combination of Harvard, Hollywood, and Burning Man, and then used it to export American ideas about relationships to the rest of the world. Eleanor was essentially running a medieval cultural influence operation, and romantic love was her secret weapon. And it worked. Within a generation, Eleanor's ideas about courtly love had spread from her court at Poitiers to England, Germany, Italy, and beyond. Nobles who had visited Eleanor's court returned home with new ideas about marriage, relationships, and personal fulfillment. It was like a virus of romantic idealism spreading across medieval Europe. But here's the really important lesson from Eleanor's story: she succeeded, because she understood that you can't change a system by working within its rules. Instead of accepting that marriage had to be loveless and that women had to be powerless, she created entirely new rules. She didn't just break the glass ceiling, she renovated the entire building. Eleanor of Aquitaine proved that one person with enough vision and courage could literally reshape the culture of an entire continent. She didn't just break the rules of medieval society, she rewrote them completely. But Eleanor was also smart enough to know that ideas without artists are just philosophy, and philosophy without beauty doesn't spread. She needed something more powerful than political statements or intellectual theories. She needed to make romantic love irresistible. That's where the real magic happened. Because Eleanor didn't just inspire a cultural revolution, she funded it, promoted it, and turned it into the medieval equivalent of a viral social media campaign. And her secret weapons weren't armies or politics. They were poets. But these weren't just any poets. They were revolutionary artists who would take Eleanor's dangerous ideas about love and turn them into something so beautiful, so seductive, and so culturally infectious that the church would spend the next century trying to ban them. And those poets were about to turn Eleanor's personal rebellion into a cultural earthquake that would reshape European civilization. These medieval poets didn't just write love songs, they created a dangerous new religion that the church tried desperately to stop. Let me introduce you to the troubadours, the original influencers of medieval Europe. These weren't guys with lutes sitting in taverns singing about pretty girls. These were sophisticated artists, philosophers, and cultural revolutionaries who developed an entirely new art form that was part poetry, part music, part political manifesto, and part spiritual movement. The word troubadour comes from the Occitan word trobar, which means to find or to invent, and that's exactly what they were doing, inventing completely new ways to think and talk about love, desire, and human relationships. It's like if Spotify, TED Talks, and a revolutionary political movement all got together and decided to completely transform society through the power of really good content. The first and most influential of these troubadours was a man named William IX of Aquitaine, who happened to be Eleanor's grandfather. According to the medieval chronicler Orderic Vitalis, William was a man given to jest and ribaldry, who shocked his contemporaries by writing openly about desire, passion, and the pursuit of pleasure. We're talking about the 1070s here, when most poetry was either religious hymns or epic war stories. William essentially invented the love song. But here's what made William's poetry so revolutionary: he wrote about women as if they were real people with their own desires and agency, rather than just objects to be won or possessed. In one of his surviving poems, he writes about a woman who knows well how to accept and refuse love. The idea that a woman could actually choose her romantic partners was so radical that it might as well have been science fiction. William's most famous poem, Postvesem de Novel Floria, since we see the trees blooming anew, includes the line, "I never tire of loving, because I always hope for joy." This might sound romantic to us, but in the 11th century it was basically heretical. The Church taught that earthly desires, especially romantic ones, were obstacles to salvation. William was essentially saying that romantic love could be a source of spiritual joy, which was the medieval equivalent of posting revolutionary propaganda, and the revolution spread. By the time Eleanor established her court at Poitiers in the 1170s, troubadour culture had exploded across southern France. These weren't just isolated artists. They were part of a sophisticated network of courts, patrons, and audiences who were all collaborating to create something completely new. One of the most famous troubadours in Eleanor's circle was Bernard de Ventadorn, whose story reads like a medieval rom-com. According to the contemporary chronicle Vidas dels Troubadours, Bernard was the son of a castle baker who fell in love with his lord's wife. His poetry was so beautiful and his story so compelling that he became one of the most celebrated artists of his generation. Imagine if someone today became famous on TikTok for writing love letters to their boss's spouse, except instead of getting cancelled, they became the most sought-after creative talent in Europe. Bernard's poetry introduced concepts that seem modern to us, but were revolutionary in the 12th century. He wrote about the nobility of unrequited love, the idea that longing could be more beautiful than fulfillment, and the concept that romantic passion could make someone a better person. In his poem Quand va la Lozette à Mauvais, When I See the Lark Move, he writes about how love has made him more generous, more courageous, and more worthy. This was the birth of the idea that love could be transformative, not just pleasurable. But perhaps the most influential troubadour was Geoffrey Eudel, who created one of the most powerful concepts in all of romantic literature, amour de loin, or love from afar. Geoffrey wrote about being in love with someone he had never met, based only on stories he had heard about her beauty and virtue. According to legend, he actually travelled to the Holy Land to meet this mysterious woman, only to die in her arms upon arrival. Now, you might think this sounds completely insane, and you'd be right, but Geoffrey's concept of distant love became one of the most influential ideas in Western culture. The notion that we can fall in love with an idealized image of someone, that longing is more pure than possession, that the journey toward love is more important than the destination. These ideas are still dominating our romantic expectations today. Every time someone falls in love with a celebrity they've never met, or stays in an unrequited crush because it feels more romantic than reality, they're living out Geoffrey Roudel's medieval fantasy. And this is where troubadour culture gets really interesting from a historical perspective. These poets weren't just entertaining nobles, they were creating a sophisticated philosophical system about love that would influence European thought for centuries. They developed specific terminology, established rules and conventions, and created a whole academic discipline around the study of romantic relationships. The troubadours introduced the concept of fin amour, refined love, which was essentially a complete reimagining of what love could be. Unlike the Church's model of love as spiritual devotion to God, or the aristocratic model of love as political alliance, fin amour presented love as an art form that required skill, patience, and intellectual sophistication. According to troubadour philosophy, true love had to meet specific criteria, it had to be difficult to obtain, it had to involve some form of service or devotion, it had to be kept secret, and it had to make both lovers better people. This wasn't just romance, it was like getting a PhD in emotional complexity. But here's the really wild part. Troubadour poetry was designed to be performed, not just read. These poets travelled from court to court, performing their works with musical accompaniment, creating the medieval equivalent of a concert tour. According to musicologist Jacques Chailly, we have surviving musical notations for over 300 troubadour songs, complete with instructions for performance and audience participation. Imagine going to a medieval concert where the headlining act was performing revolutionary ideas about love, relationships, and personal freedom, set to music that was specifically designed to be emotionally manipulative. It would be like if Beyoncé decided to become a relationship therapist and used her concerts to reprogram society's ideas about romance. And it worked. By 1200, troubadour culture had spread from southern France to northern France, England, Germany, Italy, and even as far as Eastern Europe. The Minnesang tradition in Germany, the courtly poets of northern France, the early romantic literature of Italy, they were all directly influenced by the troubadour movement that started in Eleanor's circle. But perhaps the most important innovation of troubadour culture was the idea that love could be a form of worship that was equal to, or even superior to, religious devotion. The troubadours developed an elaborate system of metaphors that compared romantic love to religious experience. The beloved became a kind of saint, the lover became a devotee, and the pursuit of love became a spiritual quest. This wasn't just poetic fancy, it was a direct challenge to the church's monopoly on spiritual experience. The troubadours were essentially saying that you could find God through romantic love, that earthly passion could be a path to transcendence, and that the church didn't have exclusive access to the divine. You can imagine how well this went over with medieval religious authorities. The church had spent centuries teaching that earthly desires were obstacles to salvation, and suddenly there were popular artists travelling around Europe teaching that earthly desires could be a form of salvation. It was like if a group of musicians today started promoting the idea that you could achieve enlightenment through really good dating. The geographical spread of troubadour influence is actually mind-blowing when you think about it. We have documented evidence of troubadours performing in courts from Lisbon to Vienna, from London to Naples. In an age when most people never travelled more than 20 miles from their birthplace, these artists were creating the first truly international cultural movement in European history, and they weren't just spreading entertainment, they were spreading a revolutionary ideology about individual choice, personal fulfillment, and the right to pursue happiness. These ideas seem obvious to us now, but in the 12th century, they were as radical as suggesting that people should be able to choose their own government or practice their own religion. The troubadours proved that culture could be more powerful than politics in changing society. They didn't need armies or laws to transform European civilization. They just needed really compelling stories, beautiful music, and a message that spoke to fundamental human desires that had been suppressed for centuries. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because while the troubadours were busy creating beautiful art about idealized love, the nobles in their audiences were starting to apply these ideas to their real relationships. And when you take romantic fantasies that were designed as artistic expression and try to live them out in the political and social reality of medieval Europe, things get complicated very quickly. What started as beautiful poetry was about to become a dangerous game that would seduce the medieval nobility into a web of secret affairs, coded communications, and romantic intrigues that would make modern soap operas look like children's bedtime stories. And it was about to become the most sophisticated and dangerous dating system in human history. What started as beautiful poetry was now becoming a real-world game that medieval nobles played with their hearts, their reputations, and sometimes their lives. Welcome to the world of courtly love, and I need to warn you up front that this is going to sound absolutely insane. What if I told you that medieval courtly love was essentially a sophisticated form of adultery that was not only tolerated by the upper classes, but actually had more rules and regulations than modern dating apps? We're talking about a system so complex that it made navigating Tinder look like child's play. The rules of courtly love weren't just suggestions. They were a comprehensive dating manual that was taken deadly seriously by medieval nobility, and the man who wrote the definitive guide was Andreas Capellanus, the cleric we mentioned earlier, who was commissioned by Eleanor's daughter, Marie de Champagne, around 1184 to create De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love. This wasn't just a book, it was essentially the medieval equivalent of the game, except instead of helping guys pick up women in bars, it was teaching nobles how to conduct elaborate romantic affairs that could last for years without ever being consummated. Andreas created a system so sophisticated that it included legal-style courts, where disputes about love could be formally adjudicated. Let me give you some of Andreas's actual rules, because they're going to blow your mind. Rule number 1. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving. Rule number 7. No one can be bound by a double love. Rule number 12. A true lover does not desire to embrace in love anyone except his beloved. And my personal favourite, rule number 14. The easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized. Do you see what's happening here? Andreas was literally creating the concept of the friend zone and presenting it as the ideal romantic situation. According to courtly love philosophy, the best possible relationship was one where you were completely devoted to someone who was just out of reach, preferably someone else's wife. But here's the really wild part, this wasn't just theoretical. Medieval nobles actually lived this way. According to court records from the 12th and 13th centuries, the aristocracy developed an entire shadow society built around these elaborate romantic games. Knights would dedicate themselves to married noblewomen, wear their colours in tournaments, write them poetry, and perform acts of service, all while maintaining the fiction that their love was pure and spiritual. Let me tell you about one of the most famous examples, the relationship between the troubadour Bernard de Ventador and Eleanor of Aquitaine herself. According to the chronicle Vidas dels Troubadours, Bernard became so devoted to Eleanor that he followed her court for years, writing some of the most beautiful love poetry in medieval literature. But here's the thing, Eleanor was married to Henry II of England at the time, and everyone knew it. The entire arrangement was built on this elaborate fiction that Bernard's love was noble and refined, because it was impossible to fulfill. He wasn't trying to seduce Eleanor in any conventional sense. He was participating in a sophisticated form of romantic theatre, where the performance of unrequited love was more valuable than actual romantic success. And this wasn't just happening between troubadours and queens. According to the chronicler Andrew the Chaplain, by 1200 most major European courts had developed their own versions of courtly love culture. Nobles would form elaborate romantic alliances that operated parallel to their actual marriages, complete with secret signals, coded messages, and public displays of devotion that everyone understood but no one officially acknowledged. Think about how sophisticated this system was. You had married nobles conducting passionate emotional affairs that were technically chaste, using a symbolic language that was complex enough to hide their true meanings from religious authorities, while still being obvious enough that everyone in court society knew exactly what was going on. It was like if everyone on Instagram started communicating through a secret code that appeared to be just fashion posts, but actually contained detailed information about their relationship status. The most famous example of how this worked in practice involves the legendary romance of Lancelot and Guinevere. Now, most people think this is just a fictional story from Arthurian legend, but according to medieval literature scholar Roger Sherman Loomis, the Lancelot-Guinevere romance was actually based on real courtly love relationships that were happening in Eleanor's circle. The story, as written by Chrétien de Troyes around 1177, includes all the classic elements of courtly love. Lancelot is completely devoted to Guinevere, who is married to King Arthur. Their love is passionate but unconsummated, secret but publicly performed through symbolic acts, and ultimately tragic because it can never be fully realised. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a story. It was essentially an instruction manual for how real nobles were conducting their romantic lives. According to court records from the late 12th century, Eleanor's court at Poitiers actually held courts of love, formal proceedings where disputes about romantic relationships were debated and decided according to the rules of courtly love. These weren't just games, they were creating legal precedents for how romantic relationships should work. For example, One recorded case involved a dispute over whether a knight could be considered faithful to his lady if he accepted a token from another woman. The court ruled that accepting the token was acceptable as long as the knight's heart remained constant to his primary devotion. Another case debated whether love could exist between married couples. The court ruled that it could not, because true love required the element of pursuit and uncertainty that marriage eliminated. Can you imagine living in a society where your romantic relationships were subject to formal legal proceedings conducted by your peers, where you could be formally censured for violating the rules of proper romantic conduct? It's like if every workplace had a dating tribunal that could rule on whether your relationship behaviour was acceptable according to official guidelines. But here's where courtly love gets really dangerous, because while everyone pretended these relationships were pure and spiritual, they were obviously creating situations ripe for actual adultery. When you have a system that encourages passionate emotional bonds between people who aren't married to each other, it's pretty inevitable that some of those bonds are going to become physical, and the Church knew exactly what was happening. Pope Innocent III wrote letters specifically condemning courtly love as a corruption of Christian marriage, and various church councils issued proclamations against troubadour poetry and courtly love literature. The religious authorities understood that this wasn't just artistic expression, it was a systematic attack on the entire medieval marriage system. But the most shocking thing about courtly love wasn't the adultery, it was how it completely reversed traditional gender roles. In most medieval relationships, men had all the power and women were essentially property. But in courtly love, women became the objects of worship, the arbiters of romantic worthiness, the ones who decided whether a man's devotion was acceptable. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just participating in this system, she was running it. According to contemporary sources, she would receive formal requests from knights asking permission to dedicate themselves to various ladies of her court. She would evaluate their worthiness, assign them to appropriate ladies, and monitor their progress according to the rules of courtly love. It was like she was operating a medieval dating service, except instead of trying to create marriages, she was creating elaborate romantic fantasies that existed specifically because they couldn't lead to marriage. Eleanor had turned romantic frustration into an art form, and somehow convinced the entire European nobility that this was the highest form of love. And here's the really crazy part: it worked. The courtly love system spread across Europe so quickly that by 1250 you couldn't be considered a sophisticated noble if you weren't participating in some form of courtly romance. It became a mark of cultural refinement, like knowing how to dance or speak multiple languages. But the success of courtly love created an unexpected problem. What happened when these elaborate romantic fantasies started influencing real marriages and actual political relationships? When knights started thinking that their courtly love devotions were more important than their feudal obligations, when queens started preferring their romantic admirers to their actual husbands, the medieval chronicler Walter Map wrote that courtly love was turning the natural order upside down. And he wasn't wrong. A system that was supposed to exist parallel to marriage was starting to compete with it. A culture that was supposed to provide harmless romantic entertainment was beginning to threaten the political stability of medieval Europe, because here's what nobody anticipated once you teach people that romantic fulfillment is important, that emotional connection matters, that love should be passionate and transformative. It becomes very hard to convince them that they should be satisfied with loveless political marriages. The courtly love movement had accidentally created a revolution in human expectations that was about to collide head-on with medieval political reality. And when that collision happened, it wouldn't just create personal drama, it would reshape European literature, transform our understanding of romantic relationships, and create stories so powerful that we're still telling them 800 years later. And those stories would become the bestsellers of medieval Europe, except these weren't just entertainment. These were revolutionary manifestos disguised as romance novels, and some of them were so scandalous that the church tried to ban them outright. Let me tell you about the medieval literary phenomenon that makes modern viral content look amateur. We're talking about manuscripts that were copied by hand thousands of times, stories that spread across Europe faster than news of wars or plagues, and romantic fantasies so compelling that they literally rewired how an entire civilization thought about love and relationships. The medieval bestsellers weren't religious texts. They were romance novels so scandalous that some libraries refused to keep them. and so popular that nobles would pay the equivalent of a modern car just to own a single copy. The first of these literary bombshells was created by a poet named Chrétien de Troyes, working under the patronage of Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, Marie de Champagne. Around 1177, Chrétien wrote Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, and this wasn't just a story. It was a cultural nuclear weapon that would explode across medieval Europe and fundamentally change how people thought about love, loyalty, and what it meant to be human. Here's what made Chrétien's Arthurian romances so revolutionary for the first time in Western literature. The central conflict wasn't between good and evil, or between Christians and pagans, or between order and chaos. The central conflict was between love and duty. Lancelot has to choose between his loyalty to King Arthur and his passionate love for Queen Guinevere, and Chrétien made it clear that love was the more important choice. This might not sound shocking to us, but in the 12th century, this was like publishing a manual on how to overthrow the government. Medieval society was built on the idea that duty to your lord, your family, and your social position was more important than any personal feelings. Chrétien was essentially arguing that individual emotional fulfillment could be more important than social obligation, which was the medieval equivalent of suggesting that people should follow their hearts instead of following the law. And people went absolutely crazy for it. According to manuscript historian Richard Barber, we have evidence of over 800 surviving copies of Chrétien's Arthurian romances, which means the actual readership was probably in the tens of thousands, massive numbers for the 12th century. These stories spread from France to England, Germany, Italy, and beyond, translated into dozens of languages and adapted for local audiences. But Chrétien's Arthurian stories were just the beginning. The real literary earthquake came with Tristan and Isolde, a story so scandalous and so psychologically complex that it makes modern romance novels look like children's books. And here's the crazy part. We're not entirely sure who wrote the original version, because the story was so popular that dozens of different authors created their own versions. The basic plot of Tristan and Isolde sounds like a medieval soap opera. Tristan is sent to Ireland to bring back Isolde as a bride for his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. But during the journey, Tristan and Isolde accidentally drink a love potion and fall into a passion so intense that it destroys everything around them. They spend the rest of the story trying to resist their feelings, failing spectacularly, and ultimately choosing death over a life without each other. But here's what made this story so revolutionary. It presented romantic love as a force more powerful than social convention, religious obligation, or even survival instinct. Tristan and Isolde don't just fall in love, they become completely consumed by a passion that makes everything else in their lives irrelevant. And the story treats this as noble and beautiful, not as a moral failing. According to literary scholar Denis de Rougemont, Tristan and Isolde introduced the concept of love death, the idea that the ultimate romantic experience is loving someone so intensely that you would rather die than live without them. This wasn't just a plot device, it was a completely new way of thinking about what love could be and what it was worth. And medieval audiences ate it up. The manuscript tradition for Tristan and Isolde is so extensive that scholars are still discovering new versions. We have evidence of the story being performed in courts from Scotland to Sicily, adapted into local languages, and influencing everything from architecture to fashion. Knights started wearing symbols associated with the Tristan legend. Ladies commissioned artwork depicting scenes from the story, and nobles began naming their children after the characters. But perhaps the most influential piece of medieval romantic literature was the Romance of the Rose, which was started by Guillaume de Lorry around 1230 and completed by Jean de Meun around 1275. This wasn't just a bestseller, it was the most popular piece of literature in medieval Europe. Period. According to manuscript specialist Sylvia Hewitt, we have evidence of over 300 surviving copies, which probably represents a readership in the hundreds of thousands. The Romance of the Rose was essentially a 22,000-line instruction manual for romantic love, disguised as an allegorical dream vision. The narrator dreams that he's in a garden where he falls in love with a rose, and the rest of the poem describes his attempts to win this rose through a series of elaborate courtships, negotiations, and psychological battles with personified abstractions like jealousy, shame, and fair welcome. But here's what made the Romance of the Rose so dangerous. It didn't just describe romantic love, it analysed it, theorised about it, and presented it as a legitimate subject for serious intellectual consideration. The poem included discussions of psychology, philosophy, ethics, and even early versions of what we'd recognise as relationship advice. Jean de Meun's section of the poem was particularly controversial because it included explicit discussions of sexuality, detailed analyses of women's psychology, and arguments about whether romantic love was compatible with marriage, social duty, and religious devotion. Some parts of the poem read like a medieval version of Cosmopolitan magazine, complete with advice on how to attract partners, maintain relationships, and navigate the complexities of romantic desire. And the church absolutely hated it. According to records from the University of Paris, several church councils attempted to ban the Romance of the Rose from being copied or distributed. Some bishops issued proclamations against reading the poem, and there are documented cases of manuscripts being confiscated and burned by religious authorities. But here's the thing about trying to ban a bestseller, it just makes people want to read it more. The controversy around The Romance of the Rose actually increased its popularity, and by 1300 owning a copy had become a status symbol among the European nobility. It was like the medieval equivalent of a book topping the banned books list and then becoming even more popular because of the censorship. These romance stories weren't just entertainment. They were creating new psychological categories and emotional experiences that hadn't existed before. Before Chrétien de Troyes, the idea that romantic love could be tragic and beautiful simultaneously wasn't really part of European culture. Before Tristan and Isolde, the concept that love could be worth dying for was mostly limited to religious martyrdom. Before The Romance of the Rose, the notion that romantic relationships deserved serious intellectual analysis was basically unthinkable. But perhaps most importantly, these stories were teaching people that their emotional lives mattered, that their personal relationships were worthy of attention and investment, and that individual happiness could be as important as social obligation. These weren't just new stories, they were new ways of being human, and the impact wasn't limited to literature. According to art historian Michael Camille, the popularity of romance literature led to dramatic changes in medieval visual culture. Suddenly, artists were depicting scenes of romantic love, couples were commissioning artwork celebrating their relationships, and even religious art began incorporating romantic imagery and symbolism. The manuscript illuminations for these romance texts are absolutely stunning. We're talking about some of the most beautiful artwork in medieval Europe, created specifically to illustrate love stories. These weren't cheap paperbacks, they were luxury objects that cost enormous amounts of money to produce, which tells us just how much medieval people valued these romantic narratives. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn while nobles were spending fortunes on beautiful manuscripts about idealized love. The reality of their own romantic lives was becoming increasingly complicated. The gap between the perfect love described in literature and the messy realities of medieval marriage, politics, and social expectations was creating tension that no one quite knew how to resolve. Because it's one thing to read beautiful stories about knights who sacrifice everything for love, or ladies who inspire total devotion, or couples whose passion transcends all earthly concerns. It's quite another thing to try to live that way when you're dealing with marriage contracts, inheritance laws, political alliances, and the daily realities of medieval life. The literature had created new expectations and new emotional possibilities, but medieval society hadn't yet figured out how to accommodate them. People were beginning to want the kind of love they read about in romances, but the legal, social, and economic structures of their world were still designed around the old system of arranged marriages and political alliances. This tension between literary fantasy and social reality was about to create some very real problems. Because when people start believing that they deserve the kind of love they read about in books, they sometimes start making choices that prioritize their emotional fulfillment over their social obligations. And in medieval Europe, that kind of thinking could be extremely dangerous. And dangerous it was, because while poets were writing about transcendent love and nobles were playing elaborate courtly romance games, the real business of medieval society was still being conducted through marriage contracts that read like corporate merger agreements. Let me show you just how brutal this collision between romantic fantasy and political reality actually was. Medieval marriage contracts weren't just about two people deciding to spend their lives together. They were complex international treaties that could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that some of these documents are more detailed than modern prenuptial agreements, more politically consequential than trade deals, and more coldly calculating than anything you'd see in a boardroom today. Let me give you a real example that'll blow your mind. In 1200, when King John of England wanted to marry Isabella of Angoulême, the marriage contract included provisions for military support, territorial rights, inheritance laws, commercial agreements, and even specifications about what would happen if Isabella died without producing male heirs. The document was 47 pages long and required the signatures of over 200 witnesses, including bishops, nobles, and foreign ambassadors. But here's the kicker: Isabella was 12 years old, and she was already engaged to someone else when John decided he wanted to marry her. According to the chronicler Matthew Paris, John literally kidnapped Isabella from her previous fiancé and forced through this marriage because he needed her family's territory to secure his hold on Western France. The entire thing was a political power grab disguised as a wedding. And this wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. According to historian Georges Duby's research on medieval marriage patterns, approximately 85% of noble marriages in the 12th and 13th centuries were arranged primarily for political or economic reasons, with the bride and groom often meeting for the first time at their wedding ceremony. But here's where it gets really wild. These marriage contracts often included provisions that sound like they were written by lawyers who had never heard of human emotions. For example, the marriage contract between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII included a clause stating that if Eleanor failed to produce a male heir within 7 years, Louis could have the marriage annulled and keep her dowry. Imagine signing a marriage contract that included a performance clause about your reproductive success. Some contracts included even more bizarre provisions. The marriage agreement between Richard the Lionheart and Berengaria of Navarre specified that Richard would spend at least 90 days per year in the same country as his wife. Apparently, they had to write fidelity requirements into the legal document. Other contracts included penalties for adultery, requirements for public appearances, and even specifications about how many servants the bride would be allowed to bring to her new home. According to legal historian Michael Sheehan, we have surviving examples of marriage contracts that include clauses about dowry payments, bride prices, military obligations, commercial rights, inheritance laws, and even diplomatic immunity. Some of these documents are so complex that they required teams of lawyers and took months to negotiate, and the economic stakes were enormous. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II in 1152, her dowry included the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, territory that was worth more than the annual tax revenue of most European kingdoms. The marriage contract essentially transferred control of southwestern France from the French crown to the English crown, creating political problems that would persist for centuries. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval marriage contracts was how they treated women's consent. According to canon law established by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a woman's consent was technically required for marriage, but in practice, this requirement was often ignored or circumvented through legal loopholes. For example, a woman could be considered to have consented to marriage if she didn't explicitly object during the ceremony, even if she had never been consulted about the arrangement beforehand. Some contracts included provisions allowing fathers to sign on behalf of daughters who were too young to understand what was happening. Others included clauses stating that a woman's consent could be assumed if she accepted gifts from her prospective husband. The chronicler Gerald of Wales recorded a case where a 14-year-old girl was considered legally married because she didn't run away when her father announced her engagement, even though she had been locked in her room and had no opportunity to escape. The legal system was designed to make it almost impossible for women to refuse arranged marriages, while maintaining the fiction that their consent was required. And this is where the tension between romantic literature and social reality becomes really clear. While nobles were reading stories about knights who would die for love and ladies who could choose their own romantic destinies, the actual women in their society were being traded like valuable commodities in deals negotiated by their male relatives. Consider the case of Blanche of Castile, who was married to Louis VIII of France in 1200 when she was 12 years old. According to contemporary accounts, Blanche had been reading romance literature and had romantic ideas about marriage and love. But her actual wedding was a political transaction designed to create an alliance between France and Castile, and she met her husband for the first time at the altar. The contradiction must have been psychologically devastating. Imagine growing up reading stories about transcendent love and romantic choice, only to discover that your own life would be determined by political calculations that had nothing to do with your feelings or desires. But here's what's really fascinating: some women found ways to work within this system to create space for their own agency and romantic fulfillment. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as we've discussed, managed to get her first marriage annulled and choose her second husband. Other noblewomen used their positions as patrons of literature and art to promote romantic ideals that gradually influenced social expectations. According to historian Amy Kelly, there's evidence that women in Eleanor's circle began including romantic compatibility clauses in their marriage negotiations. These weren't legally binding, but they represented an attempt to inject some consideration of personal feelings into what were otherwise purely transactional arrangements. Some noblewomen also used the courtly love system to create emotional relationships that existed parallel to their arranged marriages. While they couldn't choose their husbands, they could choose their courtly admirers, and these relationships sometimes provided the emotional fulfillment that their marriages lacked. But perhaps the most important development was the gradual emergence of what historian Christopher Brooke calls effective marriage, unions where emotional compatibility was considered alongside political and economic factors. This wasn't common, but it was beginning to happen, especially among the lower nobility who had more freedom in their choices. The merchant class, in particular, began developing marriage customs that allowed for more personal choice. Since their marriages weren't politically important enough to require royal approval, merchants and artisans could afford to consider factors like mutual attraction and personal compatibility. According to records from medieval guilds, there's evidence of couples who chose each other based on affection rather than purely economic considerations. And this is where we start to see the real long-term impact of the Romantic Revolution. While the high nobility were still locked into the old system of political marriages, the social classes below them were beginning to experiment with new approaches to courtship and marriage that incorporated romantic ideals. The literature and courtly culture that had started in Eleanor's circle was slowly filtering down through society, creating new expectations and new possibilities for how relationships could work. It was a gradual process, but it was beginning to change how people thought about love, marriage, and personal choice. But this evolution wasn't happening without resistance. The gap between old and new ways of thinking about relationships was creating tensions that would sometimes explode into dramatic conflicts. Because when people start believing that they have the right to romantic happiness, and when that belief conflicts with social, economic, or political obligations, the results can be explosive. And sometimes, those explosions would involve people willing to risk everything, including their lives, to pursue the kind of love they had read about in literature and seen celebrated in courtly culture. The stories of these romantic rebels are some of the most dramatic and tragic in medieval history. And these romantic rebels were about to prove that some people would literally risk their lives for love. Some medieval lovers risked everything, including their necks, to marry for love, and their stories are more dramatic than any Romeo and Juliet ever dreamed of being. Let me tell you about the real-life lovers who said screw the system and decided to follow their hearts instead of their family's political ambitions. These weren't just fictional characters. These were real people who looked at the brutal marriage system we just described and decided they'd rather face execution than live without love. The most famous of these romantic revolutionaries were Pierre Abelard and Eloise, whose love story makes every modern romance look like a Disney movie. But their story isn't just about passion. It's about two brilliant intellectuals who tried to create a new way of living that combined romantic love with intellectual partnership, and it nearly destroyed them both. Pierre Abelard was the most famous philosopher in Europe, a rock-star intellectual who drew thousands of students to his lectures in Paris. According to contemporary sources, Abelard was essentially the medieval equivalent of a celebrity professor, charismatic, controversial, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. In 1115, when he was 36 years old, he was hired to tutor the 17-year-old niece of a cathedral canon named Fulbert. Her name was Heloise, and she was already famous throughout Paris for her intelligence. According to the chronicler Peter the Venerable, Heloise could read and write in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, languages that most male scholars never mastered. She was essentially a medieval prodigy, and when Abelard met her, he later wrote that he was as impressed by her mind as he was attracted to her beauty. But here's where their story becomes both beautiful and tragic. Abelard and Eloise didn't just fall in love, they created what might have been the first truly egalitarian romantic relationship in medieval history. According to their surviving letters, they saw each other as intellectual equals, romantic partners, and spiritual companions. Abelard consulted Eloise on his philosophical work, and she influenced some of the most important theological writing of the 12th century. And then they did something that was absolutely scandalous for the time they had a secret sexual relationship. When Eloise became pregnant, they ran away together and got married in secret. But here's the thing, they tried to keep their marriage secret because Abelard was a canon of Notre Dame, and marriage would have ended his career in the church. So they were living this double life where they were secretly married but publicly maintaining the fiction that they were just teacher and student. It was like trying to conduct a clandestine marriage while one of you is a celebrity and the other is your student. Except in medieval times. The consequences weren't just professional embarrassment. They could be deadly. And they were. When Eloise's uncle Fulbert found out about the relationship, he was so enraged that he hired thugs to break into Abelard's room at night and castrate him. According to Abelard's own account in his Historia Calamitatum, the attack was so brutal that he nearly died, and his career as a public intellectual was essentially over. But here's what makes their story so remarkable even after this horrific punishment. Abelard and Heloise continued to maintain that their love had been worth the risk. In their letters, which were copied and circulated throughout Europe, they wrote about love as a transformative force that had made them better people, even though it had also destroyed their conventional lives. Heloise's letters, in particular, are stunning documents that reveal a woman who refused to apologize for choosing love over social convention. She wrote to Abelard, "I would have had no hesitation, God knows, in following you or going ahead at your bidding to the Vulcan's flames. My heart was not in me, but with you." This wasn't just romantic poetry, it was a manifesto about the right to choose love over safety, and their story spread across Europe like wildfire. According to manuscript evidence, the letters of Abelard and Heloise were copied more frequently than most religious texts. People were fascinated by this couple who had chosen romantic love over social conformity, even though it had led to disaster. But Abelard and Heloise weren't the only medieval lovers willing to risk everything for love. Let me tell you about Paolo Malatesta and Francesca da Rimini, whose affair was so scandalous that Dante put them in hell, literally. Paolo and Francesca's story reads like a medieval thriller. Francesca was married to Paolo's older brother, Gianciotto Malatesta, in a political alliance between two powerful Italian families. But according to contemporary chronicles, the marriage was arranged specifically to deceive Francesca. Her family was told she would be marrying the handsome younger brother Paolo. But on the wedding day, they substituted the older, less attractive Gianciotto. So Francesca found herself trapped in a marriage to a man she had never chosen, while living in the same household as the man she had expected to marry. According to Dante's account in the Inferno, Paolo and Francesca fell in love while reading Arthurian romance literature together. They were literally seduced by the same romantic ideals we've been talking about. Their affair continued for several years before Gianciotto discovered them together and killed them both in a rage. According to the chronicler Giovanni Villani, the murder caused a scandal throughout northern Italy, because Paolo and Francesca had become famous for their passionate devotion to each other. People saw them as tragic heroes who had chosen love over duty, even though it led to their deaths. And here's what's really fascinating. Dante's portrayal of Paolo and Francesca in the Inferno is actually sympathetic, even though he places them in hell for adultery. He presents them as victims of a social system that forced them into impossible choices, and he makes it clear that while their actions were sinful, their love was genuine and beautiful. This represented a huge shift in how medieval culture thought about adultery and forbidden love. Instead of simply condemning people who violated marriage vows, artists and writers were beginning to explore the psychological and emotional complexities of these situations. But not all medieval love rebels met tragic ends. Some found creative ways to work within the system while still following their hearts. Consider the case of Marie de France, a 12th century poet who may have been the illegitimate daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Marie wrote a series of short poems called Lies that told stories of lovers who found ways to be together despite social obstacles. Her characters used disguises, secret messages, magical objects, and elaborate deceptions to maintain romantic relationships that society wouldn't approve of. According to literary historian R. Howard Bloch, Marie's poems were essentially instruction manuals for conducting clandestine love affairs, and there's evidence that real medieval lovers used similar tactics. Court records from the 13th century document cases of secret marriages conducted by sympathetic priests, elaborate elopement plans involving multiple accomplices, and even couples who used religious pilgrimage as cover for running away together. The Church's concept of sanctuary also provided some protection for romantic rebels. According to canon law, anyone who could reach a church and claim sanctuary was protected from secular authorities, at least temporarily. There are documented cases of couples who used this protection to negotiate with their families, or even to force recognition of secret marriages. One of the most creative examples involves a couple from 13th century Germany who used the pilgrimage system to conduct what was essentially a medieval destination wedding. According to the Chronicle of Albert of Stade, they travelled to Rome under the pretense of seeking religious blessing, but actually got married by a sympathetic priest who didn't ask too many questions about their family's approval. But perhaps the most important thing about these medieval love rebels is what their stories tell us about human nature. These people lived in a society that told them their personal feelings were irrelevant, that individual happiness was less important than family honour, and that romantic love was either sinful or impossible. And yet they still chose to risk everything for the chance at emotional fulfillment. According to historian Christopher Brooke, the existence of these romantic rebels actually helped change medieval marriage customs over time. Their dramatic stories, both the tragic ones and the successful ones, gradually convinced society that completely ignoring people's emotional needs was both cruel and impractical. The medieval chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that stories of tragic lovers made people think more carefully about the wisdom of forcing marriages upon unwilling participants. Even if most people weren't brave enough to rebel themselves, they began to understand that the old system had serious flaws, and this gradual shift in public opinion would eventually create space for new approaches to love and marriage. But it wasn't just the dramatic rebels who were changing medieval romance culture. There was another group that was quietly revolutionizing relationships in their own way, and their story is going to surprise you, because it involves the people we least expect to have romantic freedom in medieval society. And the surprise is this: while nobles were trapped in elaborate political marriage schemes and risking their lives for secret affairs, peasants and common folk were quietly creating their own version of romance. And it was surprisingly modern, surprisingly practical, and surprisingly free. This is going to completely flip your understanding of medieval society, because everything we think we know about medieval romance focuses on the nobility. But here's the shocking truth: peasants often had more choice in marriage partners than nobles, more freedom to express romantic feelings, and more opportunities to marry for love. The people at the bottom of medieval society were actually more romantically liberated than the people at the top. Let me explain why this makes perfect sense once you think about it. When you're a peasant farmer, your marriage isn't going to affect international politics, change the balance of power between kingdoms, or determine who inherits vast territories. Your parents aren't negotiating with foreign ambassadors about your wedding. Nobody cares enough about your romantic choices to start a war over them. According to historian Barbara Hannawalt's research on medieval English court records, peasant marriages were primarily arranged within local communities based on practical considerations like land ownership, farming skills, and family reputation. But here's the key difference. These practical considerations often included whether the couple actually liked each other. A typical peasant marriage negotiation might involve conversations like, "Well, John is a good farmer, he's not abusive, he makes Mary laugh, and he doesn't drink too much. Mary is hard-working, she's good with animals, she seems to genuinely care about John, and their families get along." These aren't romantic criteria by modern standards, but they're a lot more humane than "this marriage will secure our alliance with France." And there's evidence that peasant couples often had significant input into their marriage arrangements. According to legal records from medieval manor courts, it was common for young people to express preferences about potential spouses, and parents generally tried to accommodate these preferences if they were practical. The chronicler William Langland, writing in the 14th century, described peasant courtship customs that included seasonal festivals, group work activities, and social gatherings where young people could meet and get to know each other before any formal arrangements were made. This wasn't exactly modern dating, but it was a lot closer to what we'd recognise as normal human courtship than the political marriage negotiations of the nobility. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of peasant romance was how much genuine affection and partnership existed in these relationships. According to the research of medievalist Francis and Joseph Guise, surviving letters and legal documents from peasant households reveal couples who clearly cared about each other's welfare, shared decision-making responsibilities, and even expressed what we'd recognise as romantic feelings. For example, court records from 13th century England include a case where a peasant man petitioned the manor court to reduce his tax burden because his wife was ill, and he wanted to spend more time caring for her rather than working in the Lord's fields. The petition was granted, which suggests that marital devotion was considered a legitimate concern even among the lowest social classes. Archaeological evidence also supports the idea that peasant marriages often involved genuine partnership and affection. Medieval household excavations reveal personal objects that appear to be gifts between spouses, carved combs, simple jewellery, decorative household items that serve no practical purpose except to show care and attention. And then there were the folk songs and popular ballads that circulated among common people. Unlike the elaborate courtly love poetry we discussed earlier, peasant love songs were remarkably direct and practical. They talked about finding partners who were kind, hard-working, and faithful. They celebrated marriages that produced healthy children and successful households. They weren't about transcendent passion or impossible longing. They were about building good lives with people you actually liked. According to musicologist Christopher Page, we have evidence of hundreds of popular love songs from medieval Europe that were performed at village festivals, harvest celebrations, and seasonal gatherings. These songs reveal a romantic culture that was much more grounded and realistic than the aristocratic romance literature, but also much more optimistic about the possibility of finding happiness in marriage. The merchant class, meanwhile, was developing its own unique approach to romance that combined practical considerations with personal choice in ways that wouldn't look out of place in modern society, because merchant families were concerned with business partnerships and commercial success rather than territorial control. They could afford to consider factors like personal compatibility when arranging marriages. Guild records from medieval cities show evidence of marriages that were arranged to benefit family businesses, but with significant consideration for whether the couples actually got along. According to historian Martha Howell's research on medieval urban life, merchant families often arrange for potential couples to work together or spend time in each other's company before finalising marriage agreements. And here's something really fascinating. Merchant marriages often included provisions for wives to participate actively in family businesses, which created economic partnerships that naturally fostered emotional intimacy. When couples were working together daily to build successful enterprises, they had strong incentives to develop good communication, mutual respect, and genuine cooperation. The famous merchant family archives from medieval Dettini of Prato include hundreds of letters between Francesco Dettini and his wife Margherita that reveal a relationship built on business partnership, mutual affection, and what we'd recognise as modern companionate marriage. They argued about money, worried about each other's health, shared jokes and gossip, and clearly relied on each other for both emotional and practical support. But perhaps the most important difference between noble and common romance was the role of seasonal festivals and community celebrations in peasant courtship. According to anthropologist Natalie Zeman Davis, medieval villages had elaborate calendar cycles of festivals, harvest celebrations, and seasonal gatherings that provided structured opportunities for young people to meet, socialise, and form romantic attachments. These weren't just parties. They were sophisticated social institutions that helped communities manage courtship and marriage in ways that balanced individual choice with family and community concerns. Young people could express preferences and form attractions, but within contexts where their families and neighbours could observe and provide guidance. The May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and winter solstice gatherings that were common throughout medieval Europe all included elements of ritualised courtship, dancing, gift-giving, games, and competitions that allowed young people to show off their skills and personalities. These festivals created what sociologist Eva Illouz would recognise as emotional capitalism, structured markets for romantic connection. And there's evidence that these community-based courtship systems were remarkably effective at creating stable, happy marriages. According to demographic research by historian E. A. Wrigley, peasant marriages in medieval England had lower rates of abandonment and higher rates of reported satisfaction than noble marriages. Despite the fact that peasants had fewer legal protections and economic resources, the key insight here is that when marriage isn't a tool of international diplomacy, it can actually function as a partnership between people who choose to build lives together. Medieval peasants and merchants figured out ways to balance practical considerations with personal compatibility that the nobility, trapped in their political marriage systems, couldn't access. But this isn't to romanticize peasant life. Medieval common folk faced enormous challenges, including poverty, disease, high mortality rates, and oppressive feudal obligations. Their greater romantic freedom came at the cost of economic security and social status. They could choose their spouses more freely, but they had fewer resources to support their families and less protection from economic disaster. Still, the evidence suggests that many medieval peasants and merchants managed to create relationships that combined practical partnership with genuine affection and mutual respect. They were quietly developing approaches to love and marriage that wouldn't become common among the upper classes for centuries, and this grassroots romantic culture was beginning to influence the broader society. The folk songs, festival traditions, and community customs that celebrated practical love and companionate marriage were slowly spreading upward through the social hierarchy, creating pressure for change in the aristocratic marriage system. But there was one institution that was paying very close attention to all these developments in medieval romance, both the elaborate courtly love games of the nobility and the practical partnership marriages of common folk, and this institution was not happy about any of it. The Catholic Church had very strong opinions about love, marriage, and sexuality, and it was about to launch what was essentially a cultural war against the entire romantic revolution we've been describing. And this cultural war was about to get absolutely ruthless. The medieval church launched what was essentially a propaganda campaign against romantic love that makes modern cancel culture look gentle by comparison. They didn't just disapprove of the romantic revolution we've been describing. They considered it a direct threat to Christian civilization that had to be stopped by any means necessary. Let me tell you about the most powerful institution in medieval Europe deciding that love itself was the enemy. The Catholic Church's official position on marriage and sexuality wasn't just conservative, it was actively hostile to the very concept that people should enjoy their relationships or feel passionate about their partners. According to church doctrine established by St. Augustine in the 4th century and reinforced by countless medieval theologians, sexual desire was inherently sinful, even within marriage. The only acceptable reason for sexual activity was procreation, and even then, couples were supposed to approach it with reluctance and penitence, not pleasure or enthusiasm. Pope Gregory the Great, whose teachings dominated medieval Christian thought, wrote that married couples should feel ashamed of any pleasure they experienced during sexual intimacy. He literally taught that enjoying sex with your own spouse was a form of spiritual contamination that required confession and penance. Imagine a religious leader today saying that married couples should feel guilty about being attracted to each other. But the Church's opposition to romantic love went far beyond sexual morality. According to theological treatises from the 12th and 13th centuries, romantic love was considered a form of idolatry because it involved placing another human being above God in your emotional priorities. The very feelings that courtly love celebrated, passion, devotion, the willingness to sacrifice everything for your beloved, were classified as spiritual sins. The influential theologian Peter Lombard wrote in his Sentences around 1150 that excessive love for one's spouse is adultery, meaning that even married couples could sin by caring too much about each other. This wasn't just prudish advice, it was official church doctrine that was taught in universities and preached from pulpits across Europe. And when the troubadour movement started spreading romantic literature and courtly love culture, the church recognized it immediately as a threat to their authority. According to the records of the Third Lateran Council in 1179, church officials specifically condemned lascivious songs that corrupt the minds of listeners and banned clergy from attending performances of secular love poetry. But the church didn't just issue polite disapproval, they launched systematic campaigns to suppress romantic literature and punish people who promoted courtly love ideals. According to the chronicler William of Newburgh, several bishops in southern France organised public book burnings where troubadour manuscripts were destroyed. Some monasteries refused to copy romantic literature, effectively censoring it from preservation. The most famous example of church opposition involves the University of Paris, where church authorities attempted to ban the Romance of the Rose from being taught or discussed. According to university records, students caught reading the poem could face academic sanctions, and professors who included it in their curriculum risked losing their positions. But perhaps the most ruthless tactic was the church's use of excommunication against prominent supporters of courtly love culture. Excommunication wasn't just a religious penalty, it was social and economic death in medieval Europe. An excommunicated person couldn't receive the sacraments, couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and couldn't participate in most forms of commercial or social activity. According to the chronicler Gerald of Wales, several troubadours were threatened with excommunication for their corruption of Christian morals, and at least one prominent poet, Macabre, was actually excommunicated for refusing to stop performing love songs that the church considered blasphemous. The church also targeted noble patrons who supported romantic literature and courtly love culture. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself was investigated by church authorities for promoting unchristian attitudes toward marriage and sexuality. While she was never formally excommunicated, the threat was always present, and it limited her ability to openly support the most radical aspects of the courtly love movement. But here's where the church's opposition gets really interesting. They understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about sexual morality or literary taste. It was about social control and the foundations of medieval civilization. The Romantic Revolution was promoting ideas that directly challenged the church's authority over marriage, sexuality, and personal relationships. According to theological treatises from this period, church leaders recognized that courtly love was teaching people that individual emotional fulfillment could be more important than religious obligation, that personal choice could override family and social duty, and that earthly love could provide spiritual satisfaction that didn't require church mediation. These ideas were genuinely revolutionary. If people started believing they had the right to choose their own romantic partners, make decisions based on personal happiness, and find spiritual fulfillment through human relationships, then the entire medieval social system, which was built on hierarchy, obedience, and church authority, would collapse. So the church fought back with every weapon they had. They preached sermons condemning romantic love as a path to damnation. They commissioned theological treatises proving that courtly love was incompatible with Christian doctrine. They pressured secular authorities to ban romantic literature and prosecute people who promoted courtly love ideals. According to the records of the Inquisition, which was established in 1231, some church investigators actually classified extreme devotion to courtly love as a form of heresy. People who claimed that romantic love was a spiritual experience equal to religious devotion could be investigated, tried, and punished as heretics. The church's propaganda campaign against romantic love was sophisticated and comprehensive. They didn't just say that courtly love was wrong, they created detailed philosophical and theological arguments explaining why it was spiritually dangerous. They commissioned scholars to write treatises proving that romantic passion led to moral corruption, social chaos, and eternal damnation. One of the most influential anti-romance texts was De Amore by Andreas Capellanus. Wait, that's confusing, because earlier we talked about how Andreas wrote the definitive guide to courtly love. Here's the twist: Andreas actually wrote his book as a double-edged sword. The first two sections describe courtly love in detail and make it sound attractive, but the third section is a complete condemnation of everything described in the first two sections. Andreas was essentially writing church propaganda disguised as a romance manual. He would spend hundreds of pages explaining how courtly love worked, getting his readers invested in the romantic ideals, and then suddenly switch to proving that everything he had just described was sinful and destructive. It was a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation designed to inoculate people against romantic ideas, and this propaganda campaign was partially successful. By 1250, the most extreme forms of courtly love culture had been suppressed or driven underground. Public celebrations of adulterous passion became less common. Troubadours began incorporating more religious themes into their poetry, and nobles became more careful about openly defying church teachings on marriage and sexuality. But the church's victory was incomplete and temporary. The harder they fought against romantic love, the more attractive it became to people who were tired of being told that their personal feelings didn't matter. Every book burning, every excommunication, every sermon condemning romantic passion just proved to people that love was powerful enough to threaten the most powerful institution in Europe. According to historian R.I. Moore, the church's aggressive opposition to courtly love actually helped spread romantic ideals by making them seem rebellious and exciting. Young people who might not have been interested in troubadour poetry became fascinated by it when they learned that the church considered it dangerous enough to ban. The church also made a crucial strategic error. They focused so much energy on suppressing aristocratic courtly love that they largely ignored the grassroots romantic culture developing among peasants and merchants that we discussed in the last section. While bishops were burning troubadour manuscripts, common folk were quietly developing their own approaches to love and marriage that incorporated many of the same ideals the church was trying to suppress. And perhaps most importantly, the church's opposition came too late. By the time they recognized courtly love as a threat, the Romantic Revolution had already spread across Europe, influenced an entire generation of nobles, and created new expectations about love and relationships that couldn't be easily reversed. The ideas were out there, the literature had been copied thousands of times, and people had already started thinking of romantic love as a fundamental human right rather than a dangerous luxury. The church could suppress the most visible expressions of courtly love culture, but they couldn't erase the underlying belief that people deserved emotional fulfillment in their relationships. But while the church was fighting this cultural war against romantic love, something unexpected was happening in the real world of medieval politics and international relations. The courtly love movement wasn't just creating literature and changing social customs. It was starting to influence actual political decisions in ways that would have consequences far beyond anything the church had imagined. Because when kings and queens start making major political choices based on romantic feelings rather than strategic calculations, the results can be catastrophic. And as we're about to discover, medieval romantic affairs didn't just break hearts, they broke kingdoms, started wars, and literally changed the map of Europe. And they absolutely did. Medieval romantic affairs didn't just break hearts, they started wars, toppled kingdoms, and changed the map of Europe in ways that killed hundreds of thousands of people. I'm not exaggerating when I say that some of the bloodiest conflicts in European history can be traced directly back to someone falling in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. This is where the Romantic Revolution we've been following crashes headfirst into the brutal realities of medieval politics, and the results are so dramatic that they make modern political scandals look like kindergarten playground disputes. Let's start with the biggest example, the 100 Years' War between England and France, which lasted from 1337 to 1453 and killed an estimated 2.3 to 3.3 million people. Most history books will tell you this war was about territorial disputes and feudal obligations, but here's the shocking truth: the entire conflict can be traced back to Eleanor of Aquitaine's romantic choices 200 years earlier. Remember how Eleanor divorced Louis VII of France to marry Henry II of England? That romantic decision transferred the vast Duchy of Aquitaine from French control to English control. When Eleanor's great-great-grandson Edward III became King of England in 1327, he inherited not just the English throne, but also Eleanor's claim to territories in France that were worth more than entire kingdoms. But here's where it gets really wild. Edward III's claim to the French throne itself came through his mother, Isabella of France, who had her own romantic scandal that destabilised two countries. According to the chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, Isabella was married to Edward II of England in a political arrangement, but she fell in love with a French nobleman named Roger Mortimer and eventually helped overthrow her own husband. So when Edward III claimed the French throne in 1337, starting the 100 Years' War, he was essentially saying, "My great-great-grandmother chose love over politics 200 years ago. My mother chose love over loyalty 20 years ago. And now I'm going to use those romantic decisions as justification for conquering France. It's like if someone today started World War III because their ancestors had complicated dating histories. And the casualties were staggering. The Battle of Crécy alone killed over 10,000 people. The Siege of Calais starved an entire city. The Battle of Poitiers destroyed the French nobility. All of this death and destruction because Eleanor of Aquitaine decided she'd rather be married to someone she actually liked. But Eleanor's romantic choices weren't the only love affairs that caused massive political disasters. Let me tell you about the romantic scandal that nearly destroyed the Holy Roman Empire and created one of the most bizarre political situations in medieval history. In 1152, the same year Eleanor married Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa fell in love with a woman named Beatrice of Burgundy. This wasn't supposed to be a political problem. Beatrice was from an appropriate noble family, and the marriage would actually strengthen Frederick's position in Italy. But here's the twist: Beatrice was already married to someone else. According to the chronicler Otto of Freising, Frederick became so obsessed with Beatrice that he essentially started a war with her husband's family to force them to annul her marriage. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. Frederick used imperial armies and diplomatic pressure to restructure the entire political landscape of northern Italy, so he could marry the woman he wanted. The conflict over Beatrice's marriage created a cascade of political problems that lasted for decades. Italian city-states chose sides. The Pope got involved, and what started as one man's romantic obsession turned into a series of wars that devastated northern Italy and weakened the Holy Roman Empire for generations. But perhaps the most destructive romantic affair in medieval history involved King Philip Augustus of France and his relationship with Ingeborg of Denmark. Philip married Ingeborg in 1193 for political reasons, but according to contemporary sources, he took one look at her on their wedding day and immediately decided he couldn't stand her. Some chroniclers suggest he was already in love with someone else. Others claim he found Ingeborg physically repulsive. Whatever the reason, Philip's rejection of Ingeborg created a diplomatic crisis that lasted for 20 years. The Danish king demanded that Philip honour the marriage or return Ingeborg's dowry. The Pope threatened to place all of France under interdict, essentially excommunicating an entire country if Philip didn't reconcile with his wife. Philip's own nobles were divided about whether to support their king's personal feelings or honour their international obligations. According to the chronicler Rigord, Philip's romantic problems contributed to military disasters, diplomatic failures, and internal political chaos that weakened France just as it was trying to compete with the emerging English Empire. Philip's personal inability to manage his marriage became a national security issue that affected millions of people. And then there's the case of King John of England, whose romantic decisions were so catastrophically bad that they literally cost him his kingdom. We mentioned earlier how John kidnapped Isabella of Angoulême to force her into marriage. What we didn't mention is that Isabella was already engaged to Hugh de Lusignan, one of the most powerful nobles in western France. John's romantic kidnapping wasn't just personally offensive, it was a massive diplomatic insult that convinced Isabella's former fiancé and his entire family to rebel against English rule in France. According to the chronicler Matthew Paris, John's theft of Isabella directly caused the loss of Normandy, Anjou, and most of the other English territories in France. But the most bizarre part of John's story is what happened next after losing half his empire because he stole someone else's fiancée. John then became so paranoid about his own wife's loyalty that he started a civil war with his own nobles. The Magna Carta, one of the foundational documents of English constitutional law, was partly a response to John's erratic behaviour regarding his marriage and his obsessive jealousy about his wife's relationships with other nobles. So King John's romantic choices didn't just cause international wars, they accidentally created the legal foundations of modern democracy. It's like if someone's bad dating decisions somehow led to the writing of the Constitution. But the most psychologically fascinating case involves the love triangle that destroyed the most powerful family in medieval Europe, the Plantagenets. Henry VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose romantic marriage had seemed like such a success story, eventually turned into one of the most dysfunctional relationships in royal history. According to contemporary sources, Henry's infidelities and Eleanor's political ambitions created a toxic dynamic that poisoned their entire family. Their sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and John Lackland spent decades fighting each other for power, often with their parents taking different sides in these conflicts. The chronicler Gerald of Wales wrote that Eleanor actually encouraged her sons to rebel against their father because she was so angry about Henry's affair with Rosamund Clifford. What started as a romantic marriage became a multi-generational family war that weakened England and created the political instability that would eventually lead to the loss of the Angevin Empire. And here's the really dark irony: Eleanor and Henry's romantic revolution, which was supposed to prove that love could be the foundation of political power, ended up demonstrating that mixing romantic feelings with political authority was incredibly dangerous. Their personal relationship problems became international crises that affected millions of people. The economic costs of these romance-driven wars were staggering. According to historian Michael Prestich's research on medieval military finance, the 100 Years' War cost England approximately $5 million over 116 years, equivalent to billions of dollars today. France spent even more. These were resources that could have been used for infrastructure, education, trade, or technological development, all wasted because various kings and queens couldn't manage their personal relationships responsibly. But perhaps the most important lesson from these romantic disasters is how they reveal the fundamental tension between individual desires and social responsibility that the courtly love movement had created. The Romantic Revolution had taught people that personal emotional fulfillment was important, that love was worth fighting for, and that individual choice mattered more than social convention. These were beautiful and important ideas that would eventually help create more humane and egalitarian societies. But when these ideas were applied by people who had the power to start wars, the results were catastrophic. Eleanor of Aquitaine's choice to prioritise her romantic happiness over political stability was brave and admirable on a personal level, but it ended up causing centuries of conflict that killed millions of people. The medieval Romantic Revolution had succeeded in establishing the importance of individual emotional needs, but it hadn't yet figured out how to balance those needs with broader social responsibilities. The kings and queens who embraced romantic ideals were often terrible at managing the political consequences of their romantic choices. And this tension between personal freedom and social responsibility was about to create an even more fundamental problem, because the Romantic Revolution hadn't just changed how people thought about love and marriage, it had completely transformed ideas about gender roles, power relationships, and what it meant to be a man or woman in medieval society. And those changes were about to collide with centuries of established social structures in ways that would reshape European civilization. And this collision would accidentally create the gender stereotypes we're still fighting today. Medieval courtly love didn't just change how people thought about romance, it completely revolutionized ideas about masculinity and femininity in ways that are still shaping our relationships, our workplace dynamics, and our cultural expectations about how men and women should behave. Here's the mind-blowing irony. The same movement that gave women more agency in choosing their romantic partners also created impossible standards that trapped them in new forms of limitation. The Romantic Revolution was supposed to liberate people from the constraints of medieval society, but instead it created a different kind of prison, one made of idealized expectations that no real human being could ever fulfill. Let me explain how this happened, because it's one of the most fascinating examples of unintended consequences in human history. Before courtly love, medieval gender roles were brutal but simple. Men were warriors, rulers, and property owners. Women were property, baby makers, and household managers. These roles were oppressive, but they were also clear and practical. Then Eleanor of Aquitaine and her circle introduced the revolutionary idea that women could be objects of worship, inspiration, and spiritual devotion. Suddenly, ladies weren't just wives and mothers, they were muses, goddesses, and arbiters of moral and aesthetic value. According to courtly love philosophy, a true knight didn't just serve his lord, he served his lady, and that service was supposed to make him a better person. This sounds progressive, and in many ways it was. For the first time in European history, women were being celebrated for their intelligence, their moral judgment, and their emotional sophistication. The troubadour poetry we discussed earlier portrayed women as complex individuals with their own desires, preferences, and agency. Compared to the earlier medieval view of women as either saints or sinners, this was revolutionary. But here's where it gets complicated. Courtly love didn't just elevate women, it turned them into impossible ideals. According to the literature and philosophy of courtly love, the perfect lady was beautiful but modest, intelligent but not threatening, passionate but pure, powerful but submissive. She was supposed to inspire men to great deeds while never actually doing anything herself. The damsel in distress archetype that we're still dealing with today was essentially invented by the courtly love movement. The idea that women need to be rescued, that they're too delicate for real-world problems, that their primary function is to motivate men to be heroic. These concepts didn't exist in earlier medieval culture, where women were expected to be tough, practical, and capable of handling whatever life threw at them. According to literary historian Sarah Kay's research on medieval romance literature, the perfect courtly love lady was described as simultaneously powerful and powerless. She had the power to inspire knights to perform great deeds, but she couldn't perform those deeds herself. She could judge men's worthiness, but she couldn't determine her own fate. She was placed on a pedestal, but that pedestal was also a cage. And this created a psychological trap that we're still dealing with today. Women were told they were special, valuable, and worthy of worship, but only if they remained passive, pure, and essentially decorative. The moment a woman tried to exercise real power or make independent choices, she was no longer fulfilling the courtly love ideal. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself experienced this contradiction. She was celebrated as the inspiration for courtly love culture, but when she actually exercised political power, leading the Second Crusade, divorcing Louis VII, participating in her son's rebellions against Henry II, she was criticised for being unwomanly, dangerous, and unnatural. The chronicler Gerald of Wales wrote that Eleanor was admirable when she was inspiring poets and hosting literary salons, but threatening when she was making political decisions or challenging male authority. Even the movement she had helped create couldn't fully accept a woman who combined romantic idealization with real-world power. Meanwhile, courtly love was creating equally impossible standards for men. The ideal knight was supposed to be brave but gentle, powerful but humble, passionate but controlled. He was expected to perform incredible feats of heroism to win his lady's favour, but he was also supposed to be satisfied with purely spiritual rewards for his efforts. According to the courtly love philosophy we discussed earlier, the perfect knight was one who could love completely without possessing, serve devotedly without expecting reciprocation, and remain faithful even when his devotion was unrequited. These standards created a model of masculinity that was emotionally sophisticated but psychologically torturous. The concept of chivalry that emerged from courtly love culture established expectations for male behaviour that were beautiful in theory but nearly impossible to maintain in practice. Men were supposed to be warriors who never used violence inappropriately, lovers who never pressed for physical satisfaction, and servants who maintained their dignity while submitting to their ladies' whims. And here's where this gets really important for understanding modern relationships. These medieval gender ideals didn't disappear when the Middle Ages ended. They evolved, adapted, and eventually became the foundation for gender expectations that are still influencing our culture today. The idea that women should be beautiful, inspiring, and morally superior, but not too ambitious or independent, that comes straight from courtly love literature. The expectation that men should be strong protectors who also express their emotions appropriately and respect women's autonomy. That's a direct descendant of medieval chivalric ideals. According to gender studies scholar Amy Vines, many of the relationship problems we see in modern dating culture can be traced back to these medieval contradictions. We expect men to be both dominant and respectful, both aggressive and sensitive. We expect women to be both empowered and feminine, both independent and romantically available. These aren't natural or inevitable gender differences. They're cultural constructions that were created by 12th century French nobles who were trying to solve very specific social problems in their own historical context. But somehow, these solutions became so embedded in European culture that we still think of them as normal and natural ways for men and women to behave. The friend zone concept that causes so much frustration in modern dating. That's a direct descendant of courtly love's idealization of unrequited passion. The expectation that romantic relationships should involve one partner pursuing and the other being pursued. That comes from medieval courtly love dynamics. The idea that true love requires some form of suffering or obstacle, that's straight out of troubadour poetry. But perhaps the most problematic legacy of medieval courtly love is the way it separated romantic idealization from practical partnership. In the courtly love system, the lady you worshipped wasn't the woman you married and built a life with. Passionate love was supposed to be spiritual and transcendent, while marriage was supposed to be practical and social. This separation created a psychological split that we're still dealing with today. Many people struggle to combine romantic passion with domestic partnership, spiritual connection with practical cooperation, or idealized love with day-to-day relationship maintenance. We've inherited a cultural system that taught us to think of true love and real partnership as fundamentally different things. According to relationship psychologist Helen Fisher's research, many modern relationship problems stem from trying to find one person who can fulfill all the different roles that medieval culture assigned to different people. We want our romantic partners to be both the idealized beloved of courtly love poetry and the practical companion of medieval marriage arrangements, and this creates impossible expectations that no real relationship can fulfill. We expect our partners to inspire us to be better people, while also helping us manage our daily responsibilities. We want them to be mysterious and exciting while also being reliable and predictable. We want passionate romance that lasts for decades without any of the work or compromise that long-term partnerships actually require. The medieval courtly love movement created beautiful literature and inspired important social changes, but it also established relationship ideals that were designed for fantasy rather than reality. And because these ideals became so deeply embedded in European culture, we inherited a romantic system that sets people up for disappointment and frustration. But here's the really important part. Understanding this history doesn't mean we have to be trapped by it. Once we recognize that our ideas about gender and romance are cultural constructions rather than natural facts, we can start making conscious choices about which aspects of this inheritance we want to keep and which we want to change. The medieval Romantic Revolution proved that it's possible to transform how entire civilizations think about love, relationships, and human connection. If Eleanor of Aquitaine and her circle could revolutionize European culture in the 12th century, then we can certainly evolve our own relationship expectations in the 21st century. But before we can figure out how to do that, we need to understand how these medieval ideas actually made the journey from Eleanor's court to our modern dating apps. Because the path from 12th century courtly love to contemporary romance culture is even more surprising and complicated than you might expect. And the journey is absolutely wild, because the path from medieval courtly love to modern romance involves the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press, the rise of capitalism, 2 world wars, and a sexual revolution. It's like watching a medieval idea time travel through 800 years of history, picking up new features and losing old ones, until it becomes something that would be both recognizable and shocking to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Let me take you on this incredible historical journey, because understanding how we got from ladies are goddesses to be worshipped from afar to swipe right if you're interested is going to completely change how you think about modern dating. The first major transformation happened during the Renaissance, when medieval courtly love collided with humanism and classical literature. Renaissance writers like Petrarch and Dante took the courtly love tradition and made it more psychological, more individual, and more focused on personal emotional experience rather than social performance. Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, written in the 14th century, kept the basic structure of courtly love, passionate devotion to an idealized woman, but made it much more introspective and personal. According to literary scholar Leonard Barkan, Petrarch essentially invented the concept of romantic love as a form of self-exploration and personal development. This was a crucial shift, because it moved romantic love from being primarily about social relationships and public performance to being about individual psychology and private experience. The Renaissance didn't abandon medieval romantic ideals, it internalized them and made them more personally meaningful. But the really dramatic change came with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. This is where the story gets completely counterintuitive, because the Protestant reformers actually rescued romantic love from the Catholic Church's opposition, but they did it by completely transforming what romantic love was supposed to accomplish. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other Protestant leaders rejected the Catholic Church's teaching that celibacy was spiritually superior to marriage. According to Protestant theology, marriage wasn't just a necessary evil for procreation, it was a positive good that could provide spiritual fulfillment, emotional support, and personal growth. According to historian Stephen Osment's research on Protestant marriage ideals, reformers like Luther actually encouraged married couples to enjoy each other's company, express affection openly, and see their relationships as forms of religious devotion. This was revolutionary, because it meant that passionate love could be both spiritual and practical, both transcendent and domestic. Protestant marriage ideals took the emotional intensity of courtly love and made it compatible with the actual married life. Instead of worshipping someone you could never have, Protestant couples were encouraged to build passionate partnerships with the people they actually lived with. It was like taking the best parts of medieval romance and making them functional for real relationships. But the Protestant transformation of romantic love came with its own complications. Protestant theology emphasized that marriage should be based on mutual affection and personal choice. But it also insisted that these choices should be made within strict religious and social frameworks. You could marry for love, but only if you chose the right kind of person with the right kind of faith. And this is where capitalism enters the story, because the rise of market economies in the 16th and 17th centuries created new opportunities for people to choose their own marriage partners based on personal preference rather than family arrangement. According to economist Gary Becker's research on the historical development of marriage markets, economic individualism made romantic individualism possible. When people could earn their own money, own their own property, and make their own economic decisions, they gained the practical freedom to make their own romantic decisions too. The merchant classes and emerging middle classes were the first to really embrace the idea that marriage could be based on personal attraction and emotional compatibility rather than just family politics and economic advantage. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century also played a crucial role in spreading romantic ideals. Suddenly, romance literature could be mass-produced and distributed to people who would never have had access to handwritten manuscripts. According to book historian Elizabeth Eisenstein, printed romance novels created the first truly popular culture around love and relationships. The most influential of these printed romances was Amadis of Gaul, a Spanish novel that became a bestseller across Europe in the 16th century. Amadis combined medieval chivalric ideals with Renaissance psychological sophistication and Protestant companionate marriage ideals. It was like a medieval romance novel updated for early modern audiences. But perhaps the most important transformation happened during the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, when philosophers and writers began arguing that romantic love could be based on reason, compatibility, and mutual respect rather than just passion, suffering, and idealization. Enlightenment thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft argued that the best marriages were those based on intellectual equality and shared values rather than just physical attraction or social advantage. According to historian Lawrence Stone's research on English marriage patterns, this period saw the emergence of what he calls companionate marriage, unions based on friendship, affection, and mutual support rather than just duty or passion. This was a huge shift from medieval courtly love, because it suggested that romantic relationships could be both emotionally fulfilling and intellectually satisfying, both passionate and practical. The Enlightenment essentially solved the medieval problem of separating idealized love from real partnership by arguing that the best relationships combined both. But the really dramatic change came in the 19th century with the Romantic movement in literature and art. Romantic poets like Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats took medieval courtly love ideals and combined them with Enlightenment psychology and Protestant marriage theology to create something entirely new. The idea that romantic love could be the most important and meaningful experience in human life. According to literary historian Mario Praz, romantic literature established the expectation that everyone deserved to experience passionate, transformative love, and that finding this love was more important than social convention, family obligation, or practical consideration. This was the birth of the modern belief that romantic fulfillment is a basic human right. The 19th century also saw the emergence of dating culture, at least among the middle and upper classes. Instead of marriages being arranged by families, young people began meeting potential partners through social events, shared activities, and mutual friends. According to historian Beth Bailey's research on American courtship customs, this period established many of the dating rituals that we still recognize today. But the most revolutionary changes came in the 20th century, when 2 world wars, the women's suffrage movement, and the sexual revolution completely transformed how people thought about gender, relationships, and personal freedom. Suddenly, the medieval assumption that men and women had fundamentally different roles and capabilities was being challenged by real-world evidence that women could do everything men could do. The invention of reliable birth control in the 1960s was particularly crucial because it meant that sexual activity could be separated from reproduction for the first time in human history. According to sociologist Anthony Giddens, this technological change made it possible for people to pursue romantic and sexual relationships purely for emotional and physical satisfaction, rather than for practical purposes. And this is where we get to the really interesting part. The sexual revolution of the 1960s actually brought us full circle back to some aspects of medieval courtly love. Suddenly, people were encouraged to pursue passionate relationships that might not lead to marriage, to prioritize emotional and sexual compatibility over practical considerations, and to see romantic fulfillment as more important than social convention. But there was one crucial difference: the sexual revolution democratized these ideals. Medieval courtly love was a game for the aristocracy, but 1960s romantic culture was supposed to be available to everyone regardless of social class, economic status, or family background. The development of online dating in the 1990s and dating apps in the 2000s represents the latest evolution in this 800-year journey. According to technology sociologist Eva Illouz, dating apps combine medieval courtly love's emphasis on choice and pursuit with Enlightenment ideals about rational partner selection and modern expectations about sexual freedom and personal autonomy. When you're swiping through profiles on Tinder, you're participating in a mate selection process that combines elements from every historical period we've discussed: medieval idealization of beauty and status, Renaissance psychology and personal preference, Protestant emphasis on individual choice, Enlightenment rationality and compatibility assessment, romantic expectations about passionate love, and modern assumptions about sexual freedom and gender equality. It's like using a technology that contains 800 years of accumulated cultural ideas about what love should be and how relationships should work. No wonder modern dating is so complicated and confusing. We're trying to navigate a system that contains contradictory expectations from completely different historical periods. But here's what's really fascinating: despite all these historical transformations, many of our core assumptions about romantic love are still recognizably medieval. We still expect love to involve some form of pursuit and conquest. We still think the best relationships require overcoming obstacles and challenges. We still believe that true love should be passionate, exclusive, and transformative. These expectations make sense when you understand their historical origins, but they can also create problems when they collide with the realities of modern life. We're trying to live out medieval romantic fantasies in a world with completely different social structures, economic systems, and cultural values. Understanding this history helps explain why modern romance culture often feels so contradictory and unsatisfying. We're not dealing with natural or inevitable relationship patterns. We're dealing with cultural inheritance from societies that had very different problems and priorities than we do today. But that also means we have the power to change these patterns if we want to. The medieval romantic revolution proved that it's possible to completely transform how entire civilizations think about love and relationships. And as we're about to discover, the next phase of that transformation might already be underway. And it absolutely is underway, because medieval romance isn't just ancient history, it's actively shaping your dating life right now in ways that are both hilarious and deeply problematic. Your dating app profile, your relationship expectations, and your romantic disappointments are all being influenced by ideas that were invented 900 years ago by French nobles who had completely different problems than you do. Let me show you exactly how medieval romance is infiltrating modern culture, because once you see these connections, you'll never look at contemporary relationships the same way again. First, let's talk about dating apps. because they're essentially medieval courtly love games disguised as modern technology. Think about how Tinder actually works. You see an idealized image of someone, you make a judgment about their worthiness based on limited visual information, and then you either pursue them or dismiss them based on superficial criteria. Sound familiar? That's exactly how medieval courtly love worked, except instead of painted portraits, we have Instagram-filtered selfies. According to digital anthropologist Nancy Baim's research on online dating culture, dating apps reproduce many of the same dynamics that made courtly love simultaneously exciting and frustrating. The emphasis on visual perfection, the importance of status symbols, the expectation that pursuit should involve some form of performance or demonstration of worthiness. These are all direct descendants of medieval romantic culture. And just like medieval courtly love, dating app culture often prioritizes the fantasy of romance over the reality of relationships. According to sociologist Eva Illouz, many people spend more time crafting their dating profiles and imagining perfect relationships than they do actually getting to know real people or building genuine connections. The swipe culture phenomenon is particularly medieval in its approach to romantic choice. Medieval nobles could afford to be incredibly picky about their romantic interests because they lived in a world where marriage and romance were separate systems. Similarly, dating apps create an artificial abundance of options that encourages people to treat potential partners as disposable commodities rather than complex human beings. But the most obvious medieval influence on modern culture is the persistence of chivalric ideals in contemporary dating expectations. According to relationship researcher John Gottman, many people still expect romantic relationships to follow patterns that were established by 12th century troubadours. One person pursues, the other is pursued. Love should involve some form of challenge or obstacle. The best relationships require dramatic gestures and passionate devotion. These expectations show up everywhere in modern dating culture. The idea that men should pay for dates. That's a direct descendant of medieval chivalric obligations. The expectation that romantic relationships should involve some form of chase or pursuit. That comes straight from courtly love literature. The belief that true love should feel effortless and magical. That's pure medieval romanticism. And don't even get me started on how medieval these expectations are when it comes to marriage proposals. The tradition of getting down on one knee, presenting an expensive ring, and making a public declaration of devotion, this is essentially a modern version of a medieval knight pledging service to his lady. According to anthropologist Helen Fisher, the engagement ring tradition specifically evolved from medieval practices where knights would give tokens to their chosen ladies as symbols of devotion. But perhaps the most problematic medieval influence on modern relationships is the persistence of saviour complex dynamics in romantic culture. The medieval damsel in distress archetype has evolved into contemporary expectations that romantic partners should rescue each other from loneliness, unhappiness, or unfulfillment. According to clinical psychologist Robert Firestone, many people approach relationships with the unconscious expectation that finding the right partner will solve their personal problems, complete their identity, or provide the missing piece of their happiness. This is a direct descendant of medieval courtly love's belief that romantic devotion could provide spiritual transformation and personal transcendence. Social media has made these medieval dynamics even more intense, because platforms like Instagram and Facebook essentially allow everyone to create their own version of medieval courtly performance. People curate idealized versions of their relationships, perform romantic devotion for public audiences, and compete for social validation based on how perfectly their love lives conform to romantic ideals. According to media studies scholar Alice Marwick, social media romance culture reproduces many of the same status competitions and performative elements that characterized medieval courtly love. The pressure to document romantic gestures, celebrate relationship milestones publicly, and maintain the appearance of perfect romantic happiness. These are all modern versions of the elaborate social performances that defined Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers. And just like medieval courtly love, social media romance culture often prioritizes the appearance of perfect love over the reality of healthy relationships. People spend enormous amounts of time and energy crafting the perfect couples photos, writing romantic captions, and documenting elaborate date activities, often at the expense of actually communicating with their partners or addressing real relationship issues. The influence of medieval romance on modern popular culture is absolutely everywhere once you start looking for it. Every romantic comedy that features a guy making a grand gesture to win back his love interest. That's medieval, chivalric romance. Every story about someone who has to choose between practical stability and passionate love. That's the medieval conflict between arranged marriage and courtly love. Every narrative about true love conquering all obstacles that's straight out of troubadour poetry. According to film studies scholar Leisure Grindon, Hollywood romantic comedies consistently reproduce medieval romantic tropes that have very little to do with how healthy modern relationships actually work. The expectation that love should be instantly recognizable, effortlessly magical, and capable of overcoming any practical obstacle. These are fantasy ideals that were created for entertainment purposes, not instruction manuals for real life. But the most fascinating modern manifestation of medieval romance is how it's influenced contemporary discussions about gender roles and relationship expectations. The ongoing cultural debates about masculinity, femininity, and romantic responsibility are essentially updated versions of the same conflicts that the courtly love movement created in the 12th century. The modern nice guy phenomenon, where men expect romantic success in exchange for basic courtesy and respect, is a direct descendant of medieval chivalric ideals that promised knights would be rewarded for virtuous behaviour. The contemporary frustration with friend zone dynamics comes straight from courtly love's celebration of unrequited passion as noble and meaningful. Similarly, many modern discussions about female empowerment and romantic agency are still struggling with contradictions that were created by medieval courtly love culture. The tension between wanting to be valued and respected while also maintaining romantic appeal, the difficulty of balancing independence with partnership, the challenge of being both strong and vulnerable. These are all problems that can be traced back to the impossible standards that courtly love created for medieval women. According to gender studies researcher Stephanie Kuntz, many contemporary relationship problems stem from trying to apply romantic ideals that were designed for a completely different social and economic system. We're trying to live out medieval fantasies of passionate, transformative love within modern contexts of gender equality, economic partnership, and democratic decision-making. And this creates impossible expectations that no real relationship can fulfill. We want our partners to be both the idealized beloved of medieval poetry and the practical companion of modern life. We expect romantic relationships to provide both transcendent spiritual experience and daily emotional support. We want passion that never fades and partnerships that handle all the mundane realities of contemporary existence. The result is a culture where people are often disappointed by relationships that are actually quite healthy and functional because they don't live up to romantic ideals that were never meant to be practical guides for real life. We've inherited a romantic system that was designed for fantasy and performance, and we're trying to use it as a blueprint for actual human connection. But understanding this history also provides hope, because it reveals that our romantic expectations aren't natural or inevitable. They're cultural constructions that can be changed if we want to change them. The medieval romantic revolution proved that it's possible to completely transform how entire civilizations think about love, relationships, and human connection. And recognizing the medieval origins of our romantic culture might be the first step toward creating new approaches to love that are better suited to contemporary life. Because once you understand that your relationship expectations were invented by 12th century French nobles, you can start asking whether those expectations are actually serving you well in the 21st century. So after everything we've discovered about the real history of medieval romance, the political calculations, the literary innovations, the religious opposition, the social transformations, and the lasting cultural influence, what does it all actually mean? What can we learn from this incredible 800-year journey from Eleanor of Aquitaine's court to your smartphone dating app? Well, that's the final question we need to answer, and the answer might surprise you. And the answer is this. The most important lesson about medieval romance isn't what it tells us about the past. It's what it reveals about the power we have to consciously shape our future relationships and cultural expectations. After spending 2.5 hours exploring this incredible journey from Eleanor of Aquitaine's revolutionary divorce to your modern dating app profile, here's the most surprising discovery of all medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They experienced the same desires for love, connection, and emotional fulfillment that we do today. The difference wasn't in their capacity for feeling. It was in their permission to act on those feelings. The medieval romantic revolution that we've been following proves something incredibly important about human nature. When people are given the cultural permission and practical freedom to prioritize emotional fulfillment in their relationships, they will create entirely new ways of loving, connecting, and building lives together. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her circle didn't discover romantic love. They invented the social and cultural frameworks that allowed romantic love to flourish. And that's the key insight that changes everything. Our ideas about love, relationships, and romance aren't natural facts about human psychology. They're cultural constructions that can be consciously designed, deliberately improved, and intentionally evolved to serve our actual needs and values. The reason understanding medieval romance history matters isn't because we should go back to 12th century relationship models. It's because recognizing the artificial nature of our romantic expectations frees us to create better ones. Think about what we've discovered over the past 2.5 hours. Medieval marriage contracts that treated women like property led to a romantic revolution that gave women unprecedented cultural power. The Church's attempts to suppress romantic love accidentally made it more appealing and widespread. Troubadour poetry that was meant as entertainment became the foundation for real social change. Eleanor of Aquitaine's personal romantic choices accidentally started wars that lasted for centuries. Every step of this journey shows us that small changes in how we think about love and relationships can have enormous consequences that ripple through society for generations. The poets and nobles who created courtly love culture had no idea they were establishing relationship expectations that would still be influencing people 800 years later. So here's the most important question. What kind of romantic culture do we want to create for the next 800 years? What relationship expectations do we want to pass on to future generations? And what outdated medieval assumptions are we ready to consciously abandon? Because here's what medieval history teaches us about the power of conscious cultural change. It doesn't require kings or queens or massive social movements. It just requires people who are willing to question existing assumptions and experiment with new approaches to fundamental human experiences. Eleanor of Aquitaine changed European civilization not because she had magical powers, but because she refused to accept that her personal happiness was irrelevant to her life choices. The troubadours transformed European culture not because they had special authority, but because they created beautiful art that spoke to universal human desires that had been suppressed for too long. And today, we have opportunities for conscious cultural evolution that medieval people could never have imagined. We have global communication systems that can spread new ideas instantly. We have scientific research that can help us understand what actually creates healthy, satisfying relationships. We have economic and social freedoms that allow us to experiment with new relationship models without risking our survival. Most importantly, we have historical perspective that allows us to recognize which aspects of our romantic inheritance are serving us well and which are creating unnecessary problems. For example, the medieval emphasis on choice and personal agency in romantic relationships that's worth keeping and expanding. The expectation that love should involve impossible idealization and constant suffering that's probably worth abandoning. The idea that relationships should provide both practical partnership and emotional fulfillment, that's a genuinely valuable innovation. The assumption that one person should fulfill all of our romantic and sexual, intellectual, and spiritual needs that might be setting unrealistic expectations. The medieval separation between passionate love and practical marriage created problems that we're still dealing with. But it also showed us that it's possible to consciously design relationship systems that balance individual desires with social stability. We can learn from their mistakes and build on their successes. And here's what gives me hope about the future of romance. The same forces that allowed medieval people to revolutionize love culture are still operating today. People are still willing to question traditional assumptions about relationships. Artists are still creating new narratives about love and connection. Technology is still providing new tools for meeting people and maintaining relationships. The difference is that now we can do this evolution consciously and intentionally, rather than accidentally and chaotically. We can study what actually works in relationships, rather than just inheriting romantic fantasies from entertainment culture. We can design dating and mating systems that serve human flourishing, rather than just reproducing historical patterns that made sense in completely different social contexts. The medieval romantic revolution succeeded because it offered people something better than what they had before. It gave them permission to value their emotional needs, agency in their romantic choices, and hope that their relationships could be sources of personal fulfillment rather than just social obligation. Our opportunity is to continue that evolution by creating relationship cultures that combine the best insights from 800 years of romantic innovation with contemporary knowledge about psychology, gender equality, communication skills, and human flourishing. This might mean developing new rituals for meeting and getting to know potential partners that prioritize genuine compatibility over superficial attraction. It might mean creating relationship education that teaches practical skills for maintaining long-term partnerships, alongside the romantic idealism. It might mean designing social institutions that support diverse relationship models rather than assuming that one size fits all. But whatever specific changes we make, the most important lesson from medieval romance history is that change is possible. The romantic expectations that feel natural and inevitable to us today were revolutionary innovations just a few centuries ago. The relationship problems that seem intractable today might be solved by cultural innovations that we haven't imagined yet. Medieval romance teaches us that love itself is one of the most powerful forces for social change in human history. When people started believing that they deserved emotional fulfillment in their relationships, it transformed laws, challenged religious authority, inspired artistic movements, and eventually helped create more egalitarian and humane societies. The capacity for love that we all carry isn't just a personal experience, it's a cultural and political force that can reshape the world when it's channeled thoughtfully and intentionally. So here's my final challenge to you now that you understand the real history of medieval romance. How will you use that knowledge to create better relationships in your own life? What medieval assumptions are you ready to abandon? What innovations are you willing to experiment with? And how will you contribute to the ongoing evolution of human love culture? Because the story of medieval romance isn't really finished. It's still being written every time someone chooses to prioritize emotional authenticity over social performance. Every time someone builds a relationship based on genuine partnership rather than inherited scripts. And every time someone has the courage to love in ways that serve human flourishing rather than cultural expectations. Eleanor of Aquitaine started a revolution in 1152 when she chose love over duty. That revolution is still happening today, and you're part of it whether you realize it or not. The question is, what chapter of this story will you write next? And that brings us to the end of our incredible journey through the real story of medieval romance. Over the past 2.5 hours, we've discovered how one woman's divorce accidentally invented romantic love, how French poets created a cultural revolution that the church tried desperately to stop, and how medieval ideas about relationships are still shaping your dating life today. We've seen that the brutal realities of medieval marriage led to a romantic rebellion that transformed European civilization. We've learned how troubadours turned love into an art form, how courtly romance created impossible gender ideals we're still struggling with, and how romantic affairs literally started wars that changed the map of Europe. Most importantly, we've discovered that our modern ideas about love aren't natural or inevitable. They're cultural inventions that can be consciously improved if we have the courage to question them and the creativity to imagine something better. The medieval romantic revolution proves that love is one of the most powerful forces for social change in human history, and understanding that history gives us the power to continue that evolution in ways that serve human flourishing rather than inherited fantasies. If this story has changed how you think about love, relationships, or the power of cultural change, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what surprised you most about this incredible journey. And if you want to join me for more explorations into the hidden histories that are still shaping our modern world, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell, because Eleanor of Aquitaine's revolution isn't over. It's still happening every time someone chooses authentic love over social performance. And I want to keep uncovering these amazing stories with you. Thanks for taking this incredible journey through medieval romance with me. Until next time, remember the capacity to love and be loved isn't just personal. It's one of the most powerful tools we have for creating a more humane world. See you next time.